watching closely.
What's the secret, Max?
You just gotta find something you love to do and then do it for the rest of your life.
I don't want to be a product of my environment. I want my environment to be a product of me.
Hello, and welcome to The Establishing Shot, a podcast where we do deep dives into directors and their filmographies. I am your host, Eli Price, joining you here today for episode 54 of the podcast. We are rolling in our early Spielberg series covering his movies from the 70s and 80s. And man, we are nearing the end with Empire of the Sun today. And yeah, I'm excited. This was a blind spot for me. I was excited to watch it, and I'm excited to dig into it with our guest today. I believe, let me think. Is this your fourth?
I think it's fourth, yeah.
Man, I think you're the first four-time guest. So congratulations.
I'm trying to come for that 5-timer club, like SNL.
Yeah. But we have Jean-Pierre Boudreaux. I said Boudreaux.
I was like, come on, you live in Lafayette. You should know better.
Jean-Pierre Boudreaux on the show with us today. Some call him by his full Christian name. I usually call him
only
JP.
When I'm in trouble.
Only when he's in trouble. But yeah, JP, it's good to have you on with us today. How are you doing? How you feeling?
I'm good. I just recently had to move, so we're in the new digs, but I'm dialing it in. It's feeling nice and homely. Yeah, I'm excited to be back. I'll say I hadn't seen this movie in a long time. I definitely know I did see it before. I think I rented it from the library, like when I was in high school. There's like one summer where we would go to the library every week, like every Saturday, and you could rent like 10 movies.
Oh yeah.
And so I would just grab 10 random movies, and then I'd watch that throughout the week and then swap them out. Fun fact, somebody had like donated their entire collection of James Bond films. Like there was like this, I guess, this old like box set where it was like all these slim MGM like black covers, and like how like sometimes when it's a box set that like the DVDs would be in like those slim cases.
Yeah.
It's like a bunch of those. And so that summer I watched pretty much every James Bond movie, I think. And so it was a good time.
That's a good summer.
It was at some point Empire of the Sun was one of those movies. I think I remember the cover. I think I definitely grabbed it. So, but excited to get into it.
Yeah. Jean-Pierre you do some videography work. If you haven't listened to a show with JP on before, he does a lot of work in videography. I think I remember seeing that you did some like I don't know to what exactly you did, but you were on set for Lisa Frankenstein that came out this year.
Yeah, so I do some freelance video work when I can. I do all the video stuff for my church primarily.
Yeah.
Got to work in the music industry. Got to go on tour last year with some friends of mine in a band. Actually, shout out Meadows. Those are my boys. And that was a lot. That was like a dream come true, honestly. But yeah, and then I also, if and when I can, work on set in the film industry, which unfortunately is really struggling right now.
Yeah.
So this is a movie podcast where we get to celebrate what we love, which is watching movies, and I also love taking part in making movies, and it's rough because firstly it's like really reliable work. Usually you got like a couple weeks to a couple months, but also it's just I just know a lot of other people are struggling as well, so it's definitely sad. But yes, I did in the past year or two of the most fun sets I was on is I was on Daisy Jones and the Six, was a show that came out last year on Amazon Prime. Worked on that show for like 3.5 months. And then, I was on Lisa Frankenstein for a few weeks, helping out with locations. And let me tell you, that was 3 very, very muddy, sweaty, wet weeks. It was like every other day, torrential downpour.
Yeah.
It was rough. It was rough, but we got it done. And you know, in my limited interactions with Zelda, she was
Mhm.
a joy to work with. She seems like she really had a passion for it and just treated everyone
Yeah.
with kindness. So
I
it's
thought it
always
was a
nice.
I thought it was a fun movie.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
checked it
I
out.
think it was exactly what it was trying to be. I remember
Mhm.
um, a lot of the gags we kind of did two versions of because they still didn't know if they were going to go for like a PG-13 or an R rating.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think they went. I think they made the right choice. I think it was a good, you know, kind of like slightly edgy, you know, PG-13.
Mhm. Yeah.
And I think it was exactly what it was supposed to be. It was intentionally cheesy,
Oh,
you
yeah.
know, and just all around a good time. It was also very surreal for me growing up watching like Sweet Life of Zack and Cody, and then
Yeah.
what's his face is like on set every day, just
Yeah.
like chain smoking cigarettes every time he's on camera. I mean,
Yeah.
and he's just like, "What's up, dude?" I'm just like, "Hey, this is so weird." But no, he was cool. He was cool. He was chilling.
Yeah. Yeah, that's cool. Uh, yeah, that's really cool. So yeah, JP has some experience on set. So I always like having people that have done some work in the industry, given some of that insight. But yeah, we are in Spielberg series, and I always love to ask my guests what their first memory of our director is. Do you remember? Do you have any like first memories of watching a Spielberg movie?
Man, I gotta say, I feel like and I feel like I might have said this for Christopher Nolan as well, but I just feel like Spielberg's just always been there in my
Yeah,
life.
yeah.
You know, I grew up in a household where we had a lot of DVDs. Like, you know, I mean, so we always had movies around, and you know, both my parents, born in the '70s, they're products of the '80s. You know, growing
Hmm.
up, and so I got to say, I feel like my first kind of introduction to Spielberg had to have been either Indiana Jones,
Hmm.
or Jurassic Park,
Yeah.
because I was a dinosaur kid.
Oh yeah.
And I remember I used to have some Jurassic Park like action figures, and I thought it was so cool. They said JP on them because I was like, oh, that's my name, you know.
Very nice. Yeah.
I want to say it would probably was Indiana Jones because I think you know Jurassic Park for like a little kid can probably be a little intense in some parts,
Sure.
but it
Yeah.
was one of those two. But I just I've always grown up with Spielberg being part of like being who he is, right? Where
Right.
he's one of the greatest to ever do it, and just always seems to, or at least I would argue for a long time, seem to always bring a sense of awe. I'm sure we can get into a little bit of maybe modern Spielberg sensibilities
Hmm.
at some point in the conversation, but.
Yeah.
But definitely 70s, 80s Spielberg, and I would argue through the 90s. Definitely just a really magical
Oh
touch when it
yeah.
comes to producing a spectacle
Hmm.
like any other.
Oh yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and we'll definitely talk about the progression of Spielberg. I feel like this movie, kind of as a set with The Color Purple, like are a pretty big point in his career. But so yeah, we'll definitely touch on that as we kind of get to the end of our talk. But yeah, let's jump into Empire of the Sun. So, one thing, if you've been listening through the series, you probably remember that Spielberg is a huge David Lean fan. As probably anyone should be. The few David Lean films I've seen, Lawrence of Arabia probably stands out to me
Oh yeah, I
as
mean
a
it's
phenomenal
phenomenal,
movie.
right?
And I'm pretty sure it was that movie that Spielberg saw when he was maybe in high school or something like that. He was wanting to go into film. He said in like interviews or whatever, he said like he went to that movie, and he came out of the movie and was like, "Well, that's it. I might as well quit film because you can't make a movie any better than that." And so, he's done it. It's been done. There's nothing else I can add to film, which, obviously he was wrong. because we have Spielberg who he is today. But yeah, obviously a huge David Lean fan. He invited him on the sets of Amazing Stories. He had kind of interacted with him some here and there, and yeah, definitely connected with him. And David Lean was coming off of A Passage to India in 1984, which I have not seen. But he did that after like a 13-year break. He had a movie that was a big flop that I can't think of the name of off the top of my head. Took a 13-year break, came back with A Passage to India, and really like wanting to kind of get rolling back in making stuff. He was approaching 80 years old, so I'm sure he was like, well, if I'm going to make some more stuff, better go ahead and make it. And Lean was really interested in adapting this novel, The Empire of the Sun by J.G. Ballard. WB, Warner Brothers, owned the rights to adapt that book at the time, and so Lean went to WB with Spielberg, as kind of like, I'm going to direct, Spielberg's going to produce, and wanting to adapt the film. So there was a plan in place for it to be adapted by this guy named Harold Becker, who had directed a movie named Taps in 1981. I don't know that guy or that movie, so can't speak.
Is that a reference to like the military trumpet song?
Yeah,
okay.
it was a military film. So he at least had experience making war movies. I don't know if Taps is any good or not because I haven't seen it and don't know
I never even heard of
about
it. So
Yeah. So, but yeah, he was working on a screenplay with a really accomplished playwright named Tom Stoppard. So they had something in the works, but when David Lean and Steven Spielberg come to you, it's kind of like, well, maybe we should go ahead and give it to those guys. And so pretty convincing for Warner Brothers. So
absolutely, yeah.
Yes, and it probably helped that Steven Spielberg had a growing relationship with Warner Brothers CEO Steve Ross. They were getting to be pretty buddy. So
I mean, David Zaslav would have just been like, "No, you guys can leave because that man can apparently not make a good financial decision or a good decision in general." I don't know.
Yeah,
but
yes.
But at least somebody was with a good head on their shoulders was in charge back then.
Oh yeah, yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. Well, so they get the movie, but David Lean eventually drops off as director, and recommends that Spielberg direct it. I think he decided to pursue a different project. He felt like the story wasn't kind of unraveling as he was like hoping, and it just wasn't like. I guess it was one of those things where, as a director, he started to feel like, okay, I thought I wanted to direct this, but maybe I'm not the best person to direct it. As he started working on it, and he also was like approaching 80 and thinking, well, shooting in China is going to be pretty strenuous. Better let the young guy do it. So yeah, and Spielberg in an interview said from the moment I read the novel, I secretly wanted to do it myself. So Spielberg was happy to take it on.
I can't imagine being in that position though. Like you have like this idol of yours,
yeah,
who's like, "Hey, I kind of want to make this movie, and I'd like you to maybe produce it for me."
mm-hmm.
And you're just like, "I really want to do this, but okay, yeah,
David Lean.
but it's him, it's the guy, It's
yeah.
I can
It's my
definitely
hero.
imagine that was a bit of a difficult, big slice of humble pie he probably had to eat.
Yeah.
Before.
Yeah. I get the feeling he was happy to just be working with Lean, and so
just happy to be included. Just happy to be involved.
But yeah, so J.G. Ballard's novel, written in 1984, it was semi-autobiographical. It's kind of based on his memories of his kind of privileged childhood in the British enclave of Singapore, and the subsequent internment in the POW camp by the Japanese in World War II. he said, this is a quote from Ballard. He said, "Many of the ventures Jim goes through are invented, but I think his psychology is very true to mine."
Interesting.
Yeah. So it's kind of this fictional. It's almost like he wrote the novel as a fictional expression of kind of how he remembers feeling, I guess, maybe. Is kind of how I kind of take that. If I understand correctly, Ballard was not separated from his parents quite like Jim was in the movie. I think he ended up being interned with his parents. So
Oh, just yeah, that's crazy because that's like a
yeah,
completely different story in that case. I mean,
yeah, yeah, different and not, I guess, too, because you're still like imprisoned in a camp. And even if your parents are there, it's kind of like, it's still like basically like Law of the Jungle. I mean, um, but yeah, he also said it took him 20 years to forget this experience and then 20 more years to remember it, which makes sense because he's writing this novel about right around 40 years from the events. So
well, it's especially interesting that WB, had the rights to this book
mhm.
so soon, like so
That's
close to
pretty
when it
tip
came out.
I'm starting to find that that's pretty typical.
Okay.
Whenever a book comes out, I'm pretty sure like there's people that work in Hollywood that just like I'm sure Warner Brothers and whoever Paramount and everyone, they just have people that are like snagging these like
Yeah.
popular books and telling them who they need to buy,
Do
what books
you
they need to buy the rights to.
do you know if it was like pretty popular when it came out? Like, did it make any? Was it like a
I
bestseller or
didn't
anything?
I didn't really see anything in my research about that.
Hmm.
But
Okay.
it must have been, I mean, like WB has the rights to it. David Lean has read it and wants to make the movie. So I would imagine, just going off of that it was I mean, I don't know if it was like huge, but it was obviously like popular enough for it to be,
Well,
you
it
know,
feels like David Lean might have been, well, not close to the same age as Ballard at the time, but a book like that might have intrigued him because he lived through it himself.
yeah, yeah. And he was British too, so um that probably there's that connection too.
Hmm.
Uh but yeah, so I don't know. It was at least like mildly well known for it to be already Warner Brothers having the rights and all that. So, but yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, so Spielberg is kind of he reads the book, obviously wants to make it. He's kind of drawn to the horrors of war seen through this like impartial, at times helpless, and mesmerized eyes of a young boy, which makes a lot of sense for Spielberg. Um, and as we'll talk about, kind of makes sense for where he is in his career too, like kind of like a stepping stone, a transition point. So, but yeah, so I mean, Jim in the movie, the main character, experiences death and famine, illness, solitude, cruelty, and violence at the hands of men. He's kind of experiencing all the horrors of war and death, and so at the same time, though, he's excited by like these air raids, by the bravery of the Japanese and Americans both. So it's kind of like
Yeah.
this weird mix of like horror and admiration, which fits right in line with pretty typical Spielberg themes of the time, which are kind of fear and like awe or wonder. Um, you know, so it really like is hitting on all cylinders for a Spielberg movie.
Yeah, I don't know how much you're really wanting to dive into like the plot, but I definitely feel like there's an attempt to try and humanize like the Japanese in
Mm,
this movie, which part of me like can really understand because obviously like they're human beings. Not every single person that was a part of the Japanese army was there by choice necessarily, or was
sure.
someone. but also like if you know even just a little bit about the history of the Chinese invasion of China
Oh yeah.
and how horrific they were. In fact, there's actually another movie that Christian Bale's in called The Flowers of War, I think. Which
Hmm.
I can't remember if I've seen it or not. I may have, but I've definitely seen like the cover for it around. That's like during like I think it's like just at the 20s during the invasion of and like the issues that went on like Nanking, when the Japanese kind of got involved. And so I don't know. I feel like I don't really know
Hmm.
if he really finds a balance there
Yeah,
when you
yeah.
talk about I do love that kind of like it's basically the opening of the movie where Jamie's like I kind of want to join the Japanese Air Force, like
Uh-huh.
they have better pilots than we do,
Yeah.
and it's really interesting to see him with his like fascination of planes all throughout,
Hmm.
which reminds me of myself, as a younger guy. Like I went through an airplane phase
Yeah.
myself, and so but I don't really know if he really gets a payoff for that as well. Like
Yeah.
um, there's almost I wonder if you picked up on this, but I didn't notice it when I originally saw it, but I just watched it today again, and I almost saw some Phantom Menace Anakin Skywalker in this character, and I
Mm.
wonder if George Lucas was inspired by the portrayal of Jamie in this movie because I feel like I don't know I
Yeah.
kept watching it I feel like I'm watching Jake Lloyd's Anakin Skywalker right now in
Yeah, I
some
mean,
parts.
I can see some of that. And as we dig more like into the themes of the movie, I think we'll probably like dig into this deeper. But yeah, I mean, you have a kid who's very like in almost every sense is kind of displaced. Like where he's not in his country of origin, wasn't even born there.
Yeah, he
Like
says he says he's never been. He's literally
yeah,
been in China his whole life. He's never been
yes,
to
he's
England.
never been to England. He's like he's in this weird period where everywhere around him he's starting to see the effects of war on the Chinese, but he's kind of isolated from it at first. And then like when they finally like start imprisoning the Westerners, it's just like it's these eyes of a through this perspective of a kid who just like
Yeah,
doesn't have any sense of like who should I be for, where do I belong, like yeah, it's pretty unique perspective wise, I think.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think we'll get into some of the cinematography a little bit later. But can we talk about the shot where it's like they're all leaving for the Halloween party and
Hmm.
they have to go through that checkpoint and you see
Yes.
all the Chinese crowds. There's literally this prolonged shot of one of the families all dressed as clowns.
Yeah.
And I thought that shot was so funny because it's like so representative of like you have these snobby, uptight British socialites, driving from one side of town to another for this Halloween party. I'm
Uh-huh.
assuming it's Halloween because they're all dressed in
Yeah,
costume.
right. Yeah.
Uh, and they're having to drive through all these crowds of Chinese. They have like the guards getting on the outside of the officers or soldiers or whatever they are on the outside of the cars with sticks beating off the crowd.
Mhm.
And you just have this whole entire family dressed as 1940s clowns. One of them's like has like a little kite outside the door or something, and it's like he almost like holds that shot.
Yeah.
And I felt like he was saying so much with that
Yes.
in that moment. It
Oh,
was it
yeah.
was it was quite humorous.
Yes. Yeah, I guess, like, I didn't, I do now that you're saying that, I do remember that, and, like, thinking back, I'm like, "Yes, like,
That really
yeah,
stuck
I
out
guess
to
they
me.
are clowns."
you know.
Uh, but yeah, I mean, yeah, and we'll get into some of those, like, there's a lot going on visually here that I think is really well done that we'll get into as we, dig into, like, the production and all that, but I do want to touch on Spielberg. Like, so some other ways that Spielberg's connected, I guess, to this movie. Um, like you were saying, your fascination with planes as a kid. And planes are just cool.
They
So
are.
I think
Even now, planes are
yes,
cool.
planes are
I
cool.
you
Like
know
there's it's a big. hunk of metal that flies. Like, it's pretty cool. But yeah, Spielberg was fascinated with aviation at the time, had always been probably, and also with World War II. His father, Arnold Spielberg, served in the Air Force. And so he kind of had this fascination with World War II because of that and aviation and, you know, being interested in something that is connected to your father makes sense.
Yeah, my dad was
So
he always wanted to be a pilot, but
yeah,
he didn't go to college, and he always told me he was like too tall to be a pilot because he's like 6'2". I don't know
yeah,
how true that is. I think it's more the fact that he just never went to college. He only had a high school education when he joined the
mhm,
military. So the closest he could get was he was a mechanic on Huey helicopters
okay,
when he was in the
cool,
Navy, I believe. So
yeah,
so I think part of that was from me as well, is that like, when I was like 5 or 6, really into planes, it was part of it was like it was a way for me to connect with my dad, because
yeah,
my dad, he's always loved aviation. Like,
yeah.
he could
My
tell you when he was a kid, all he wanted to be was a pilot.
my dad's dad, my grandpa, he was a mechanic for Delta for
Okay.
years until he retired. So, I always remember thinking that was like pretty cool when I was a kid that my grandpa like was basically like a plane mechanic, just
Yeah,
cool, doing
literally.
welding and whatnot. Um,
It's cooler than being a
yeah,
car mechanic. I mean,
yeah,
no offense to all the car
that's
mechanics
what my
out there,
dad
but
was. My dad took the step down. My dad was a car mechanic. So,
hey, they're important too. They're important too. But
but yeah.
plane mechanics just a little bit up more up there for sure.
Oh man. The other connection that I found in my research for Spielberg actually had some ancestors that fled Jewish persecution out of Russia, Ukraine area. He has some ancestry there. They actually fled persecution and went to Shanghai.
Hmm.
So, um, yeah, I just thought that was like, oh, that's pretty cool. Like, there's another like little small connection there. But yeah, so Spielberg is doing the movie. He brings on Menno Meyjes, who worked with him. He worked with him on Amazing Stories series, and he also did The Color Purple, the script for that. So brings him back. I guess he enjoyed working with him. He reworked the script a little bit, and then they brought back in Tom Stoppard to put finishing touches on it, doctor it up, that sort of thing. And what's funny is like, so Tom Stoppard, I guess, wrote the original screenplay. Minnow reworked it, and then Stoppard finished it up. But when you look at the credits, like in the movie, it's Stoppard who gets the writing credit. There's not a writing credit for Meyjes.
Interesting.
You really only see. I don't even think on Letterboxd it is. I think you can see Meyjes in IMDb. But
Yeah,
yeah, he
credits
definitely,
are
yeah, it's a
it's a
weird
weird
thing.
thing.
Yeah. But
It's
yeah,
it's
they
all
both
about
worked
the
on it.
unions.
Oh yeah. They
Yeah.
both worked on it. Stoppard, I guess Stoppard probably did the most work on it, having written like the original script. So I guess that makes sense. Stoppard had his own little connections to this story. He was the son of a Jewish family who had fled Czechoslovakia from the Nazis and spent some of his youth in Singapore. So he had a little connection there himself. And him and Spielberg kind of became really buddy working on this together. Stoppard had a more like cerebral sensibility that meshed well with Spielberg's like more sentimental sensibility. So they kind of like were kind of a perfect storytelling match, I guess. And Stoppard went on to kind of become Amblin Entertainment's
Oh wow.
designated script doctor. Like they would bring him in to kind of doctor up scripts a lot. Um, which I think is cool. You find that's how the industry works. You find your guys that you work well with, and you stick with them. Um,
Yeah, for
but
sure.
but yeah, the biggest challenge that they had when writing this, uh, you know, moving it from book to film, was condensing the second half of the book where they're at the Lumois. It's hard to I don't know exactly how to pronounce it. I listened to the book on audiobook, and he pronounced it Lunois. Lunois, I think, is the best I can do. So, but yeah, they trying to condense that. They decided to focus on the Jim Basie relationship. There's more relationships Jim has with other people in the book. You get some of his relationship with Dr. Rollins in the movie. There's a bit more of that in the book.
I'm gonna be honest.
Yeah,
they could have done a lot more condensing.
maybe so.
That
Yeah.
is the one thing. Rewatching this movie today, where I was like,
yeah,
man,
it was a challenge for him. Yeah,
this movie is long.
well,
Like,
it gets going like the first about hour or so is like, I mean, it's moving, and it does slow down a good bit once they get to the camp for sure.
I really felt like I was like, man, like, not that it felt, not that I don't know, it just felt very like amateurish for like, I feel like it could have been a much tighter film overall, but I understand, like, especially realizing that the author of the book was like, it's more of a like mythological version of what he went through, not necessarily a
Right.
directly like realistic version of what he went through. That I can kind of understand why, because it almost is like a mythological journey of sorts that Jamie goes on.
Yeah,
almost, where
it's a bit of a fantasy in a certain
Yeah.
way. Yeah,
very
kind of
realistic fantasy, but a fantasy nonetheless.
Right. Yeah. They very much admit that was a challenge, condensing that part, and yeah, maybe it could have used some more condensing, but they did decide to focus on that relationship. Another David Lean influence here. David Lean adapted some Charles Dickens. He did Great Expectations in 46 and Oliver Twist in 48, which I haven't seen those, but I kind of want to go watch those now because yeah, that sounds like it seems like I would enjoy those. But yeah, they kind of accentuate the Dickensian characteristics of Basie, kind of this.
Definitely see that.
Yeah, he's
King of the Street Rats kind of vibe,
right. Yeah, and he is to Jim what Fagin is to Oliver Twist, kind of this crooked mentor,
see that for sure.
exploiting him and corrupting him, but also like at the same time, like kind of teaching him how to like follow the law of the jungle, how to survive, how to make it, So
I will say, and it's been a while since I've like read or seen any versions of Oliver Twist, but I will say, which interesting, we haven't had like a modern take on Oliver Twist or really any Charles Dickens. That's a kind of interesting thing. But I will say, I feel like, if I remember correctly, that Fagin at least like had a little bit of some kind of care for Oliver Twist, like in his own twisted way.
Yeah,
we could definitely get into it, but there are so many times where I feel like Basie showed him that he only cares about him as long as he's useful.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And which like I said, we could talk more about, but yeah, there's a lot of like very like interesting characters in this movie for sure. We'll dig into the characters in a minute. First, let's I'm gonna roll through the crew here. The main players. Of course, you've got the trio of Spielberg, Kathleen Kennedy, and Frank Marshall producing the Amblin crew. We already talked about J.G. Ballard and as this original story, and then the screenplay from Tom Stoppard and Menno Meyjes. Stoppard has some really good work too. He worked on the movie Brazil, which I haven't seen, but is pretty well respected. But it's pretty good. Yeah.
Shakespeare in Love was one of his later ones, and he came back and worked on Last Crusade, Spielberg again. So and then we talked about Menno Meyjes having worked on The Color Purple with him. The director of photography is Alan Devillard, who is recurring. I think this might be his last go with Spielberg, actually. He did E.T. with him, the Twilight Zone movie, and The Color Purple. And so, yeah, I think this might be his last movie with Devillard. But yeah, I kind of like his cinematography work in those movies, and this one included. So we'll talk about that. Michael Kahn, his two like most faithful and true collaborators are his editor Michael Kahn and John Williams for the music. Those two guys are like basically Spielberg. They basically like do every Spielberg movie for most of his career.
It's like, yeah, I mean, for
Yeah.
me, it's like Nolan and Zimmer, you know,
Right, yeah.
like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, we got some sound guys coming back. Charles L. Campbell from E.T., along with some other guys. Production design, Norman Reynolds, who did Raiders of the Lost Ark with him, coming back for this. Which makes sense. It's the sets here are, you have some pretty like elaborate outdoor sets that feel like they have a small connection with, I guess, Raiders.
Well, I mean, even though Raiders is the 30s and this is the 40s, like the architectural styles and things like that
the period,
didn't really change too terribly much.
Yeah.
So I could definitely see why, he'd go with somebody that already kind of had experience in that general time period.
Yeah,
definitely would have been able to kind of come in and like make sure things were as accurate as they can get.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, the Charles Bishop does the art direction. Art direction and production design, they work pretty hand in hand. Kit West does the special effects, which I didn't see anything else that Kit West was on. There are very few things like.
Hey, shout out Kit.
So Kit West,
he got his one in.
Yeah. I did find this wasn't in like IMDb or anything. It was in one of my books. Peter Aston was like the main guy in charge of the model aircrafts. So shout out to Mr. Aston. The lead stuntman, Vic Armstrong, Big Vic. He's if you're listening to this and you're like, why is he making a big deal out of Vic Armstrong? It's because Vic Armstrong is basically like all the coolest things you see Indiana Jones do. That's really Vic Armstrong, and not Harrison Ford. So Harrison Ford does a lot of stunts. Shout out.
He also crashes a lot of aircraft.
Give him his respect. Yeah. But Vic Armstrong is the one that does like the coolest stunts for Indy. So yeah. And then casting, there's this team, Mike Fenton, Jane Feinberg, Julie Taylor. They were his like go-to for a while for his casting. They cast the indie movies, E.T., Goonies, Back to the Future, Poltergeist. So those few right there show
all the
heavy
hitters.
Yeah, they were big for getting those kid actors, which I think is a big deal. Which we'll talk about Christian Bale in a second. But they also had Yuriko Matsubara, who I didn't see exactly who he casted, but I'm almost positive he was casting the Japanese and Chinese actors for the movie.
I would assume so, most likely.
Which is smart, get a Japanese guy to help cast the Japanese characters. It makes sense to me. But yeah, speaking of the cast, we have Christian Bale as Jim or Jamie or James, whatever you want to call him, I guess. Mostly Jim, I think, in the movie. But yeah, it took 9 months to find this kid. He was 13-year-old at the time. There was like 4,000 auditions, and he stood out. He had done some acting. He was in a few things before this. He had worked with Rowan Atkinson, Mr. Bean himself, in 1984's The Nerd. He had done a miniseries called Anastasia in 1986 with Spielberg's wife, Amy Irving. So there was a connection point there, and Omar Sharif was in that series too. So, yeah, so he had some experience coming in, and yeah, I think Christian Bale is really great in this. J.G. Ballard even said like he was surprised how similar Bale was physically to him at that age, which was cool. One of my favorite things. that and there's like a little on the Blu-ray disc. There's a making of documentary that kind of talks about the history around the movie, and then also kind of like some behind the scenes making of stuff too. And they're filming the scene where Bale as Jim is like crawling through the mud, doing the pheasant traps, setting the pheasant traps, trying to not get caught by Sergeant Nagata. And Spielberg like says cut or whatever, and he kind of mumbles to himself, but the camera and the mic for the making of doc pick it up. He says, "A little Steve McQueen, this kid," which is like pretty. That's pretty high praise. And so, yeah, another thing another quote I thought was good. This goes back to those casting directors. He said, "I get credit for the kids, but I'm just lucky to get great kids in my
Yeah,
movie."
that's kind of
Yeah.
an ongoing theme. I think a lot of these Spielberg films, especially like in the 80s into the early 90s. I mean, he did have a lot of movies that had kids as like main, like kind of really big parts of it.
Yeah.
I mean, I always think of like, the two kids from Jurassic Park.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously in a movie like this, like it's no surprise it took 9 months to find their Jim, because the whole movie hinges on this performance.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think that, for the most part, I can't really think of a single Spielberg film that involving, kids in the cast, where the kids like. It's always weird when you hear people like crap on like child actors, because like guys are literally
Yeah.
kids. Like, come
Yeah.
on. But to an extent, there is definitely, I think, especially a lot of family movies when they have like kid
Yeah.
actors, like they can be kind of annoying
Mm-hmm.
to watch, just personality wise. But shout out to his casting team, because I mean, I
Yeah.
feel like he says, he just gets great kids.
They're knocking it out with
he's
these kids for sure.
yeah.
I mean, if going back to that list I named out, E.T., Goonies, Back to the Future, Poltergeist. I mean, and then this movie, like all like fantastic kid casts, like just really good. I don't know how old Michael J. Fox was in Back to the Future, so maybe that doesn't really count. But
I think he was probably in his 20s, but I mean,
yeah,
he's relatively kind
yeah,
of young.
he's playing
I mean,
the
or
high
think of
schooler.
Josh Brolin in Goonies,
Yeah,
which
mm-hmm.
it's like crazy to think that that's him.
Yeah, yeah, and even Sean Astin, in
Yeah,
Goonies, like yeah,
unrecognizable.
great. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, for sure. When you know it, you can see it, but yeah, if you didn't know that, you wouldn't be like, "Oh yeah, that's Sean Astin as a kid." But yeah, I mean, just really great. And Christian Bale here is, I think, is really, really good. He works really well with Spielberg, and like watching the making of doc and watching like him interact with Spielberg, um, you can tell that this kid like knows what he's doing. Like he's totally like tuned in. He's like taking Spielberg's notes and like running with it. Like he's like he just seems like even this early on, he had a strong knack for acting. And
Yeah, I mean,
which
definitely. I mean,
yeah,
and then that's why nowadays he's known as
yeah,
definitely one of the greatest actors of his kind of generation, if
mhm,
not in general. I mean,
yeah, yeah, for
so
sure,
many iconic roles over the years.
yeah, yeah. I mean, like Spielberg's giving him notes, like in the scene where he loses his mom and is reaching for the plane. Like Spielberg's coaching him through. He's like, okay, like in this scene, you know, there's this big choice you have to make. You drop your airplane and you have your mom's hand, and you have to decide between your mom and the airplane. And like Bell like takes that thought process and like runs with it in his performance. And I think it like he
Yeah,
captures that. He like really actually, as a 13-year-old, captures that moment just visually. Um,
yeah. I mean, this movie really takes Jim. There's definitely an element of like coming of age
yeah,
story
for sure.
to this film,
Mm,
and I think that Bale really sells Jamie's like transition
yeah,
from this super spoiled bratty kid that just could not be bothered to like be decent.
Yeah.
To someone who you know actually learns how to be a survivor,
Right.
and learn and there's that scene when he first gets back to the house after being separated from his parents, and he sees two of the Chinese like maids, I guess.
Yeah.
And he's like, "What do you guys think you're doing?" And she walks over and slaps him,
Yes.
and I'm like, he kind of deserved it.
Yeah.
Like
Absolutely.
he was being a massive dick.
Like two
to
scenes
her
ago, he was like,
specifically.
"My biscuits."
You have to do what I say.
Oh man, yeah, but yeah. I mean, he's great. And obviously his career has proved that to be true. That he was a great actor all along. And I have this book. It's up here. I've mentioned it before on the podcast. Steven Spielberg, all the films. It's actually came out, I think, at the end of last year. So fairly new book. But it has like it goes through every film, but then it'll have like kind of in between articles sometimes. And it had like a really fun article that was like basically where are his child actors now? And so it like went through all of his child actors in his movies, like the main ones, and where they are now. So it was cool to see like a wide range of like the kid from Close Encounters just like works in finance now.
Yeah.
Like all the way to like Christian Bale, who's I would say is probably the most acclaimed actors that were a Spielberg child actor. Drew Barrymore is pretty high up there, I think. Playing Gertie in E.T., but Christian Bale.
Maybe at one point, but not anymore. I feel like
Yeah.
I can't tell you the last time I saw her in a movie. I think she has
Right,
like a talk show.
but I just mean having a career where you're like Drew Barrymore, and people are like, "Oh yeah, Drew Barrymore." It's a pretty like she's a known name in Hollywood pop culture.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, I think Christian Bale probably by far has had the most like successful career amongst those child actors for sure. And yeah, I just think it really comes out here. Going through we'll dig into the character of Jim a little bit more, but just kind of going through the rest of the cast. Of course, you have John Malkovich pop up as Basie. Malkovich was still relatively unknown. Like he had some like so he
wild to think about.
He had a supporting actor nomination from Places in the Heart from '84. But we all know how that goes. Like supporting actor nominations, sometimes those guys are like, who is that guy? And that's kind of how Malkovich still was at the time. It was still a year before his kind of turning point role in Dangerous Liaisons. But yeah,
it's crazy because he's such a iconic.
Yeah,
it's such an iconic name, iconic face, like his voice, his delivery. It's just it's hard to imagine him as like a relatively unknown actor.
Yeah.
But I guess there is a point to say that like a lot of like his most famous like over the top roles definitely come up in like the 90s and 2000s for sure.
I mean, Con Air I think is one of them for sure.
Put the bunny down.
And then I mean, being John Malkovich is just like another level of. Have you seen Being John Malkovich?
It's on my list. It's one of those movies I've always wanted to see and just never gotten around to it. But I'm sure I'd enjoy it.
You've got to see Being John Malkovich.
Is that Charlie Kaufman, right?
Yes, it is bizarre.
Yeah, I mean, I had to watch his film Sendoki, New York, for a class in college, and that film
was depressing,
extremely trippy.
Yeah, that film is really depressing. This one isn't like uplifting at all. It's not as depressing as Synecdoche, New York, but it's still depressing. Being John Malkovich, but yeah, how he convinced John Malkovich to be in that and make it his namesake like is is impressive. But yeah, it's a wild movie. Anyway, yeah, John Malkovich, I think, is, you know, doing his best scummy sailor kind of guy in this movie. Yeah, you can tell too from the making of that he was pretty tuned into what he was doing. There was a point where he's like learning a Chinese phrase and is like taking notes, and it's just kind of like funny. Like you have like two lines you have to say in Chinese or Japanese, and he's like really tuned in, like trying to get it right, which I respect. I respect that. But it is funny. We'll dig into, like I said, we'll dig into characters a little bit later. But yeah, everyone else is pretty mild as far as characters go. You have Miranda Richardson playing Mrs. Victor.
Okay, I couldn't tell. For some reason, I thought it was Michelle Pfeiffer.
No, Miranda
But
Richardson.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Mhm.
I always remember her as oh my gosh, the lady. She's in Phantom of the Opera. She's like the lady who's like over all the dancers or whatever. That's the role I always remember her as.
Yeah, I put in my notes she went on to be in The Crying Game in '92. Was probably one of her biggest roles. Nigel Havers plays Dr. Rawlins. I think he does a good job. He was Lord Andrew Lindsay in Chariots of Fire earlier in the '80s, so that was kind of his bit. I think that was probably his biggest role, and then this. I seem to remember hearing that he was more of like a British TV actor, maybe. But I might be wrong on remembering that. But yeah, Joe, you got a really early Joey Pants role. Yeah, Joe Pantoliano as Frank, Basie's kind of sidekick in the movie. Yeah, and he's got some very Joey Pants line deliveries in this movie, which I appreciated.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think just like with John, I feel like he's just one of those people that just has a very iconic voice, like mannerisms.
He's like the classic that guy in a movie, you know. It's
I wouldn't have. Yeah, I've never thought about categorizing him as that guy. Like I hear that guy, I always think of like James Cromwell is like a that guy, or William Fincher is a that guy.
No, I really think
I guess he could be.
He just pops up in movies, and you're like, wait, hey, it's that guy that was in that movie. Guy. Yeah,
that's fair. That's fair. I mean, I think, you know, obviously his most iconic role is probably like Cypher in The Matrix.
Yeah,
the first film.
Yeah, Cypher in The Matrix. He's popped up before on the podcast for Memento. Great Memento.
I also like him in Daredevil.
Okay.
As he's like a reporter who's like trying to figure out who this Daredevil guy is, you know.
Yeah, I think I've seen the movie, but I just don't remember much about it.
It's you know what? Yeah. It's a lot better than a lot of people give it credit for. It's a good time. It's a good time, man. I'll give it that.
That's all.
The soundtrack slaps for sure, especially.
Yeah. Rolling through the rest of the cast real quick. You have Masato Ibu playing Sergeant Gata, and then Takataro Kataoka. I'm probably butchering these names, but that's okay. I mean, it's not okay, but it's what we've got. It's the best I can do. He plays the kamikaze pilot boy that kind of that Jim. Yeah, that Jim kind of connects with. A few others. Leslie Phillips plays Maxton. Emily Richard and Rupert Fraser play Jim's mom and dad. Peter Gale plays Mr. Victor. And then you have a early Ben Stiller playing Dainty.
The guy and he popped up and I laughed because I was like, I texted you earlier today. I totally forgot Ben Stiller is in this movie, and his you know, I mean, I think they did. Just kind of going on the kind of production design / really, I just want to talk about the makeup real quick. Like the makeup crew in this job did a great job of it's a really interesting juxtaposition between like the British like prisoners in the camp,
Sure.
like who are still trying to like maintain that
Yeah.
a
Sophistication.
Britishness,
Yeah.
sophistication, and then like every time we're in the American bunker, like everyone's just
Oh yeah. They're
dirty.
dirty.
They're
Like,
slimy. Their
having a
teeth
good
are
time.
gritty. They are having a good time, but
Yeah.
but him especially, like Ben Stiller's. It's funny that his name is Dainty because
Because he's
the
not.
the couple times he's on screen, he is just a greasy looking dude. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah,
Oh yeah.
it's interesting.
I think I did skip the hair and makeup costume people when I was going through the crew. But yeah, Vera Mitchell did the hair, Paul England did the makeup, and Bob Ringwood did the costumes. Shout out to
Yeah.
those guys for sure.
Yeah, they all did a great job all
Yeah.
around. I mean, like everything felt very in period, but especially like
Oh
like I
yeah.
said during the internment camp, they just did a really good job
Those
of
dirty
of
Americans.
those and Jamie wants to be nothing more than another dirty American.
Oh yeah.
Just like the rest.
Which I love. I love the scene where he finally like gets the in and is able to. They allow him to move into the American dorm, and Christian Bale gets to do his American accent. He kind of does a line delivery and I can't remember what he says, but he like puts on an American accent. And I'm like, oh yeah, he's already working on his
Which is
accents.
crazy because I feel like when I was younger, I feel like it was probably like the Batman, like Batman Begins was probably my first time seeing Christian Bale in anything.
Sure, yeah.
And I remember like my mind being blown when I figured out he was British.
He's Welsh, yeah. Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Pardon me, British
Which
Isles.
which is still British, but I just think
right.
just to emphasize, like the Welsh accent is like sometimes even like stronger,
It's very brogue for sure. Yeah.
than kind of like the more typical British like English accents, I guess.
But for a long time, I thought because his American accent's so good. For a long time, I thought he was American. Then when I found out he's actually British.
Yeah, he can do different American accents too, which yeah.
I feel like he's one of the actors I've heard him. I know Gary Oldman kind of has said this before, that Gary Oldman has done so many like interesting accents over the years that he actually had to like relearn his native accent. And I feel like I've kind of heard something similar from Christian Bale, but I can't remember for sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, he does it. He's great. He's
for sure.
He's definitely good at what he does.
Yeah. The only other cast I was going to point out this is more of just a fun fact, but J.G. Ballard himself plays a guest at that costume party that we were talking about early on in the movie. So that's a fun little, I guess, Easter egg, which I didn't notice obviously when I was watching because I didn't know what he looked like when I watched. But yeah.
Which guest was he? Would I recognize him?
I don't remember. I don't remember.
I wonder if he's the guy who like there's that scene where they first walk in. There's that kind of chunky guy at the door who just kind of like laughs. Like
I think that is him because he's a little bit heavier set guy, and so I think that might be him.
Because I'm like that's the only party guest
that
really sticks out in like a little moment that's not like a character having an actual conversation.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think that probably was him. But yeah, I honestly just don't. They showed it in the doc, but I just don't remember. Hi. Quick reminder that yes, you can be a huge help to the production of this show. If you visit establishingshotpod.com/donate, you'll find out how to join the Establishing Shot family through some giving tiers starting as low as $5 a month. You heard that right, only $5 a month. And not only will you be helping me keep the show going, but you'll also get some perks yourself, like early and ad-free episodes, bonus episodes, access to a Discord server where we can chat it up about the show and movies in general, and more. Might even let you choose a movie for me to review for the show. Check out that link in the show notes to learn more. Back to the show. Yeah, let's jump into the production. They talking about locations. They couldn't find a good alternative to Shanghai. And at the time, it was, you couldn't really go to China and film. And so, I mean, you still can't just go somewhere and film. You still have to get the okay, but it's easier now. But at the time, China was still pretty closed off to the West. And so they went to the Chinese authority, and they had some intense negotiations, is what I read. It didn't say what that entailed, but intense negotiations leading to an agreement for them to shoot in Shanghai. It's probably a little bit thanks to Spielberg being on there, and also just like the movie covering something that probably they thought was important for people to see, I guess. Maybe helped. But yeah, it was marketed as the first Western production filmed in the People's Republic of China, but it actually wasn't. Bernardo Bertolucci's The Last Emperor was filmed there several months before, which is kind of ironic. We'll touch on it again when we get to the Oscar nominations, but Last Emperor shows up again when we talk about that. So, but yeah, they started production at the beginning of March. It was I guess like a 4-month production. I guess March to June is kind of when they shot, but they started with 3 weeks in Shanghai. They had local extras and police security provided by the China Film Corporation. And really, like, they took advantage of, so Shanghai. We'll talk we'll touch a little bit on, once we get through production and stuff. We'll talk a little bit about the history, the actual history, because to give a little bit more context for the themes and stuff. But yeah, Shanghai had very strong Western influence, and before the war. And so there was a lot of very European architecture in this historic riverfront district called the Bund, or the Bund. And they took advantage of just those visuals for the movie, and really, like, drew massive crowds when they were filming. And even in, like, so in the making of doc, it was cool too. They interviewed a few people in the crowd, just Chinese people showing up to watch them shoot, and they were just talking about how there was one guy that was saying, like, he was there, during the event and during the actual events, and he was like watching this and like kind of reliving it, and he was like, it's pretty similar to how it felt back then. So I think that's, I guess, credit to some of the authenticity of what they're displaying for that stuff. But I thought that was pretty cool.
Well, I mean, if you think of Temple of Doom, the opening of that movie's in Shanghai as well. So
yeah,
Spielberg definitely
it wasn't shot
likely
there,
familiar. Oh, well,
yeah, it was shot in I'm blanking now. We talked about it on the episode. It was shot in a territory that at the time was maybe Portuguese.
Okay.
It was shot in a territory like near Hong Kong in China, but it wasn't It wasn't like Chinese. It was still like a territory of Portugal or some other European country, I think, at the time. So yeah, they couldn't even shoot that in Shanghai, which they didn't shoot in India either for that. It was in Sri Lanka. So they're faking us out on all accounts on Temple of Doom. But yeah, Spielberg, they did the 3 weeks in Shanghai, which we'll go back to Shanghai in a second. But before the next phase of shooting, Spielberg made his way to the Oscars. Just to touch on this, he received the Irving G. Thalberg Memorial Award, which was basically for producers that had like put out consistent, high quality stuff. And so it seems like kind of like an honorary award for people that are just like putting out a bunch of good stuff.
I mean, if anyone deserved it,
Yeah.
especially at the time,
Yeah. Not just like,
definitely him.
yeah, it's not just directing, but just like he's producing so much during this
Yeah,
period.
I was gonna say, I was like, I feel like, in my mind, like he's almost as iconic of a producer as he is a director. I mean, there's quite
Yeah,
a few
at this point, yeah.
there's quite a few directors nowadays that got their start from. I mean, I think of someone like J.J. Abrams. Like some of his
Mhm.
early
Yeah.
films were produced by Spielberg, and it's like having someone who I'm sure J.J. looks up to Spielberg. So having someone
Yeah.
like that put their stamp of approval on your work and like help you kind of get your name out there. I mean,
Yeah.
I can
Robert
imagine
Zemeckis was a big one back in the
yeah.
80s.
Which definitely, I feel like Robert Zemeckis definitely has done stuff very similar to like the dramatic side of Spielberg. You know,
Yeah.
I always say like
Yeah, he's very like he feels I guess thematically and storytelling very like similar to Spielberg, which yeah, and it makes sense. They worked on a World War II film together in 1941. But I don't want to talk about 1941 because it was Spielberg's first attempt at a World War II movie that went terribly wrong, in my opinion. But yeah. Have you ever seen 1941?
I don't believe so. I don't believe
I
I've ever
would,
had the pleasure.
I would,
Somewhere
I
in the
would,
back of my mind, maybe I've seen some clips from it. I think,
yeah,
but
yeah. I would recommend maybe watching some clips and then just go listen to our episode and don't and instead of watching the movie, you'll probably have a better time listening to us talk about it than
it's
watching it.
that bad, huh?
I think it is. There's people that like it, but I think they're pretty.
I don't know.
far
I'm a
between.
sucker for a very like ridiculous, over the top humor.
Well,
That's like always
it's
been my humor.
ridiculous. I don't remember laughing in the movie at all, but it is ridiculous. I'll say that. But yeah, they went back to after Shanghai. They went to Elstree Studios in London, his faithful, tried and true studio for shooting. It seems like he's just been shooting there nonstop for all of his movies. Maybe not not for The Color Purple. They were in America for that, but
Sounds
everything.
like Star Wars and Pinewood Studios, also in
No,
England.
Star Wars is was Elstree. That's how
Oh
he
well, I'm
got.
talking about now. I guess more modern
Oh
Star
yeah,
Wars.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
I always hear them associated with Pinewood Studios, which
Yeah,
is
so
also in England.
he got connected with Elstree starting with Raiders because that's where Lucas shot Star Wars, and so he was familiar with it and went back. They were like, he was just like, let's go shoot at Elstree, and
Good
then
old
so,
George Lucas.
yeah, now Spielberg just wants to keep shooting at Elstree, I guess. But yeah, they did all the indoor scenes of Jim's home, some of the outdoor shots of like the British sector or at Elstree. The final bombardment of the city is at Elstree. So they did a good bit of stuff there. And then they moved on to, I think they wrapped up in Spain, near a place called Trebujena. Probably pronounced that wrong. I'm usually pretty good with Spanish, but that one is tricky. But yeah, Norman Reynolds, the production designer, had a internment camp built on some land bordering some marshes. So all of the last part of the movie at the internment camp was shot there. They had some torrential rains and a mosquito invasion apparently hold up the construction for 5 weeks.
Oh gosh,
So it must have been
sounds like Louisiana.
real bad mosquito invasion. Yeah, it was near some marshes, so sounds close to home to me.
Don't do it.
We're surrounded by swamps over here in Louisiana, so yeah, production design as far as that goes. Going back to Shanghai, rickshaws had apparently been banned by Mao Zedong as a symbol of capitalist oppression. So there were no rickshaws in Shanghai at the time. So they had to make a bunch of them. I think they made about 100. And then they, alongside some tanks and period cars, they flew them all over on some 747s. which that sounds like a good little budget spent there, flying a bunch of stuff
Sounds
over on
like
747.
a little throwback to the Steve Zissou episode. Sounds like when
Yeah,
Wes Anderson was like, "Why don't we just like buy this boat,
and
like instead of building one?"
sell it around Africa to the
Yeah,
Mediterranean.
it'd just be easier. Or
Yeah,
like when Christopher Nolan was like, instead of doing like a model plane, what if I crash an actual
an
airplane
actual
into an
airplane.
actual airline, like airplane hangar? You know, it's
At an
just
airport.
at an airport. It's just cheaper. It's just cheaper.
It's already there,
I loved all the
Yeah.
jokes from when Oppenheimer was coming out, where they were going to be like, when Christopher Nolan explodes an actual atom bomb,
Yeah.
so he can keep things,
Real.
like
Yeah.
realistic. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
It's
Yeah. Well, Steven
times.
Spielberg did that too for Crystal Skull, so put Harrison Ford in a
Actually, put
fridge.
Harrison Ford in the
Yeah.
fridge. Yeah, that was real. That was 100% real.
Oh man.
No Victor for that one. It was all Harrison.
Yes, love it. Yeah. So also in back to Shanghai, for the post Pearl Harbor invasion sequence, they had apparently, this is what I read, 10,000 extras
I
in
believe
period
it.
dress. It was a heck of a lot of people, I'll tell you that. It was
This is
definitely
like one of those things. This is like one of the things where like they don't, like, this doesn't happen anymore.
Oh yeah.
Like
Yeah,
post
you don't do this. Yeah.
post CG, like
Mm-hmm.
you might have a couple hundred, maybe 1,000 tops. But then as soon as you kind of
Yeah.
get out to the stretches, I mean, movies are just made so much differently. And then on
Yeah.
top of that, you had like post COVID, things
Mhm.
are just done
Yeah.
so much differently now.
Yeah.
But there is something just so
Oh,
like it's hard to describe when you're watching a movie like this and you see some of these big wide shots with like all this stuff happening, and
Yeah.
that everything you're seeing is for the most part actually happening in camera. So when
Yeah.
you see the shot with like just a sea of people, it's literally a sea of people.
Yeah,
Like
it's-
it's I don't know. There's something about it.
I read somewhere I heard it described as a tidal wave of humanity, and I would add on to that. It's like a tidal wave of like fear and panic. Like it's like it's really visually like oppressive in a way. That's
It reminds me of the shot from there's like a really famous shot from like Gone with the Wind, I
Mhm.
think, where they do this big like crane shot where they pull back and you just see all these soldiers
yeah.
lying everywhere, injured on the plantation that Scarlett lives on.
Yeah, which
It's that kind of vibe where you're just like, I don't know. It's like one of those things like only Spielberg could pull something like this off, where you literally have like just a sea of people. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, they even closed off like a 7-block area, which had never been like closed off before to do this in. And I looked at in the making of doc, they showed like some period footage of that block, and it looks like it hasn't changed. It didn't change in the 40, 50 years since the actual events, which is really cool. But yeah, they used some real Chinese military men in that scene. One of the crazy things, so like we were talking about, it's a sea of people. It is wild. When they're being pushed along by the crowd, kind of carried along, like it really feels like, and it seems like they actually were. And they trained this group of people to like surround them. So like the people immediately surrounding the actors are like trained bodyguards to like to help protect them through the crowd. So that alone should tell you how like
Well,
out of control it was.
On that, having, I can tell you, especially when I worked on Daisy Jones, we had a couple bigger like crowd scenes. But what they do a lot of times nowadays is like they maybe they'll have like 300 extras and they'll arrange them, they'll shoot them, and then they'll move them to another section, rearrange them, shoot them, and then they stitch it all together
right
in post if they don't do just straight up CG for massive crowds. But One of the things I can say, having worked on sets, is you'd be surprised when it comes to extras, when it comes to people that are background actors. Some of these people take themselves way too seriously.
Sure,
And
yeah.
I can only imagine like adding on, like, it's a different culture, it's a country that's a little more closed off, there's a language barrier. I can only imagine like how difficult it might have been to try and work with some of the background actors.
Yeah.
And in this case, I wouldn't really put the blame on the background actors
Hmm.
necessarily. But definitely from my experience working on sets here in the States, like, there are some people that just make things way too difficult, and it's like,
Yeah.
dude, you're gonna be a blurry face in the background if you're lucky.
Yeah.
But one of the other things I can also say is, on Daisy Jones, there's a shot where she they do a set, they're doing a show at like an arena,
Hmm.
and she like walks to the edge of the stage, she turns around and she falls back, and she gets like carried by the crowd.
Yeah.
And they did this really cool, like, they had a techno crane, so they did this really cool shot. It was like above, like watching her be carried. And the way that they did that is they had maybe 200 extras altogether, but the people who directly handled the actress, for lack of a better term, like the people who
Hmm.
were actually responsible for carrying her along, were all stunt people.
Yeah.
So they
Yeah.
were all, so they did, and they were the only ones that were allowed. Like, they had them all in a predetermined path.
Hmm.
So much like this, it is pretty normal. Like, when you have something that's going to be a little more technical, to like have, more than just background in the immediate
Right.
area. So like we did like a wide shot with a stunt double for her, and she did it first. And then when they did like the close ups with uh, Riley, what's her face, who played Daisy, it was all stunt people who were the ones who were actually like
Yeah.
carrying
Yeah.
her through the crowd, just so it was people who like had an extra level of responsibility and
Hmm.
training. So that's pretty normal. But yeah, it makes total sense that you would have made sure that, like,
Yeah.
immediately around your actors, considering in this case they're likely just hiring random people off the street to
Oh
come and
yeah. They're
be
just
a
it's
background actor in a situation like
yeah.
this. So you definitely have to
Because I mean,
have
you
a
have
level of
thousands of people.
safety.
You can't vet. You can't just vet them all.
Right, yeah. And
Yeah.
plus, like I said, like, if you're dealing with, at the time, a country that's just kind of starting to reopen
Right.
to Western
Hmm.
influence. There's that, but also the language barrier. There's just a
Yep.
lot of
A
levels that,
lot.
like, you got to
Yeah.
make sure, and especially on top of that, you're working with a kid actor. There's
Yeah.
always extra levels of like safety and
Hmm.
security you got to be concerned about. So that makes
Yeah.
total
Bell.
sense they would have done that.
There's a clip of Belle talking about that scene and saying like, at first I felt really claustrophobic, and I'm like, yeah, you
I
don't
would have
say.
too.
Emily
Same,
Richard, who plays his
same
mom,
kid.
was still ended up getting thrown to the ground in one take. So I mean, even with like the special bodyguard protectors, like it was still like probably more dangerous than you would think just watching the movie. Because when you're watching the movie, you're like, oh, it's a movie, but it was wild. They did get I love this. They got a $13,500 fine for pollution because they were burning tires for the smoke in the scene.
I know that that probably smelled terrible. I already know.
I also love this. Scorsese was which they were part of the movie brats crew of the
New
70s and
Hollywood.
80s. Yeah.
Yeah.
So they they were I don't know how close he was with Scorsese, but they were friends, acquaintances for sure.
I know him
But
and Coppola were like much closer,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
I think.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, but so Scorsese, I don't know. I didn't look at what the source was for this, but it was in one of the books I used for research. Scorsese was talking about this scene and how like Spielberg would like storyboard it and stuff, but also like when he thinks of something else, like he is able to just like make it happen on the fly. But this is the quote. Scorsese said, "He told me that he had first drawn all the plans and that at the last minute he imagined something else. Who else can do that?" And I just love that. It's even Scorsese's like, I can't do that like Spielberg can,
I wouldn't even. I mean, even
Yeah.
beyond who else can do that, who else can actually has the fortitude to make it happen? I
Yeah.
mean, there's always things that, like, on the day, there's like little moments of inspiration and things that happen, but it's so that's one thing. But to be able to kind of change your mind last minute, but also like have
Mhm.
the crew ready to do what needs to be done to change it. That's the real test of leadership as regards to a film set, for sure.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, some other kind of production design stuff that I thought was fun. Maybe not fun, but just like, oh yeah, that's interesting that how they did that. The Chinese that were in the forced kind of labor outside the camps, in the movie they're always like covered in white dust. And Ballard was talking about how he just remembers the Chinese people that were in that forced labor were just always covered in the white dust from like the concrete and all that. And they sprayed the actors with talcum powder for that effect, which I thought was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Talcum powder. Obviously, if we're going to talk about production design, we got to talk about the planes. They had there's two, I guess like three main planes. You have the Japanese kamikaze planes, which are Mitsubishi A6Ms, also known as the Zeros. And so those are like a very famous, well-known plane from World War II. And then
If you ever seen a World War II movie involving the Japanese, that's probably the plane that you've seen.
You see the Zeros, yep. Or a Miyazaki movie. And then you have the U.S. So I mean, you have the B-29s, which are in the movie. But then there's the U.S. P-51s, the Mustang, which is also called the Cadillac of the Sky, which Christian Bale yells at the top of his lungs.
Cadillac in the sky.
Cadillac of the sky. Yeah, so some of these were real planes that they used, that were those actual planes. Apparently they cost around $500,000 each. So there's you some budget money there.
That's wild. You think they could have just like rented them? Like,
I don't know. Maybe insane. They did. Maybe what I saw in my research was just saying how much they were worth, but I don't.
That would make more sense. I would imagine there was likely some kind of, aerospace museum that was like, wait, Spielberg wants to borrow some planes? Yeah, of course.
But I guess if they are like
they probably have to insure
protected
them
and stuff, yeah, you have to like rent it, but also insure it. And I'm sure that costs a lot because I'm sure they really, really wanted to protect those being like period planes. But yeah, most of the planes were remote controlled models. They were about 1/3 scale. We already shouted out, I think Peter Aston. I'm scrolling back up to get his name right. Yeah, Peter Aston, the main model guy. Yeah, they had anywhere from 7 to 18-foot wingspans, which I'm sure the B-29s are the ones with the 18-foot wingspans.
They're big planes.
Yeah.
In real life.
Yes. But yeah, apparently from what I saw, these were the largest plane models used in film up to this point, which is kind of cool. A cool fun fact. Yeah, I thought the plane work was really well done. They in the making of docs, the guys were talking about how when you're flying these, so like you'll have 3 guys down on the ground with remotes, and like every once in a while one of the planes will kind of like veer off, and like but when you're just down on the ground and there's 3 of you flying planes like right next to each other in a group, you always assume like, oh, that's not mine, that's veering off. And so like you just keep flying it, and then you finally realize like, oh, that's mine.
Yeah, I can imagine that,
Yeah, that was funny to me. Makes total sense. But yeah,
it's probably something that's a lot easier these days with the advancements of technology.
Right, yeah.
As far as even if you are still using scale models, but I can definitely imagine it can be a little bit like disorienting.
Yeah.
Like I have friends that are like drone operators, and when you're a professional drone operator, like you're on movie sets, like you always have to have 2 people. So you have one person that's the actual pilot, and they have to keep their eyes on the drone at all times, and you have your other operator that's operating the actual camera portion.
Yeah.
And so you allow each person to focus, but I can imagine
cool,
like you got a couple guys flying RC planes right next to each other, It's really easy to get mixed up.
Yeah.
Whose is whose.
Mhm. Yeah, especially if you're doing like kind of stunt work with them,
Right.
mixing them up and whatnot. Which, yeah, I've heard that the Michael Bay's movie Ambulance has some like incredible drone work, and I really want to see
FPV.
that.
Yeah.
Have you seen it?
I've not, but I mean, obviously, I saw the trailers, and I
Yeah.
saw like I've seen videos of people talking about the team that worked on it and like talking about some of the shots. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's a lot of FPV drone work.
Yeah.
So
I
which
want to
is
see
like
that. If for nothing else, but to see that drone work, because I've heard it's really,
yeah.
really
Well, there's like a
cool
couple other
stuff.
movies where it started to pop up more and more
Yeah.
often, and a few other movies as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of production design stuff we could get into. I think the camp looks really good. Really great work there. Like
I love the
the
little
window.
marshy part.
Yeah, the marshy
Oh
part.
yeah, the
The
window
window
and the
is so cool.
American.
Yeah.
Yeah, the American dormitory window. Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. But I think my favorite part of the camp set's definitely the little wetland area that Jim has to crawl through.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
just a really
Spielberg
cool
definitely
vibe.
does some. I think he does some like camera angle magic to make that seem bigger than it is.
Of course.
Yeah, really. Yeah, it looks good. The camp just in general, I think, looks really good. You know, shout out to that town in Spain, I guess. But yeah, as far as cinematography, camera work, I mean, of course, you've got tons of tracking shots. You've got cranes galore, crane shots galore. Spielberg is like, I guess, the crane shot king at this point. But yeah, I mean, beautiful wide shots throughout the film. I think this movie is like really beautifully shot in general.
Mm.
You're a more camera savvy guy than I am, though. What were your thoughts on just like how it looks?
Yeah, I mean it's one of those movies where I wouldn't really say that it has a style, but
Hmm.
it's a very realistic film, right?
Yeah,
It's not trying to be a movie per se. It's trying to tell Jim's story in a very realistic way. And so there's definitely some shots that really stick out to me. I kind of talked about the shot of like the family of clowns
mm-hmm.
in the car that I really liked. Um, there's there's quite a few. I mean, there are some really impressive wide shots throughout the
Yeah,
movie with the massive extras. Or like another one I think of is like when they get to the arena where
yeah, mm-hmm.
all the possessions are, like all the wealthy house possessions, and they do like a really big wide shot of that, and then you just see the production design on
Mm-hmm.
display. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I don't know. It's not like the most, like, if you want to talk about like movies that I look at and I feel like are cinematic, this probably wouldn't be a movie that
Mm.
I necessarily think of. But at the same time, like I said, like it's not trying to be this like fancy, over the top, like, oh, look at how cool we are with this one shot we just
Sure,
set up.
yeah.
You know what I mean? Like,
You've got some pretty like typical Spielberg
yeah.
shots in this movie. I do think there are times where the way it's shot, like I agree that there's a lot that is going for a more like naturalistic look, but I do think so I'm just like making the connection. So you have Alan Devillard, who also worked on Goonies with him and The Color
Mhm.
Purple, and
Mhm.
those movies both have this grounded look that has this like almost at times hazy fantastical look,
Mhm.
kind of, and I see that some here that kind of
Yeah, there's
adds
definitely a
to
little bit of
that.
it.
Yeah, in certain sequences it's definitely there, I think. um and I think it's more like, I think he couldn't do it as much in this film as he did for the others, because there's less like interior shooting, which you can work with the smoke and the lighting a little bit to give that effect a little more in the
Yeah, I
interior.
mean,
But yeah.
I definitely think it's one of those things where if you want to talk about like the Spielberg one or that Spielberg magic,
Hmm.
I don't think this is the best display
Sure.
of
Yeah.
that. But at
Right.
the same time, because it is a more or less some version of a true story, and it's talking about some very serious subject matter. I think it didn't really need all that fanciness. I
Yeah.
think it serves its purpose in being a very, for lack of a better term, very dry, cinematically speaking. Like, but
Yes.
but it not. I don't mean that in a bad way. It's just it is what it is. And I think they do a really good job of centering it around Jamie, and like there's a lot of really good shot. Like I really love the. Is one of the things that's maybe more of a production costuming thing than him specifically. But I love like the juxtaposition between him and that red coat.
Hmm.
In some of the scenes, like there's a scene where he's like gets separated from his mom, and
Yeah.
he's like pushing through the crowd, and everyone else is in like grayish blue, and he's in that kind of like dark red coat, and so it's you don't lose him in the crowd.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of moments like that where I think that they made just
Spielberg
really
does use red.
smart decisions. Yeah, you think of like
Yeah.
Schindler's List
Uh-huh.
as well as like
Right.
very infamously.
Hmm.
But yeah, there's just I don't know, there's I think that the best shots in this movie for me a lot of times are a lot of the really grandiose wide shots,
Yeah.
which with just the sea of people in them. There's a lot of good ones like that.
Oh yeah.
For sure.
Yep, for sure. Last thing, production wise, the score. John Williams, of course. It's a beautiful, sweeping score. He's really like similar to E.T. to me, really like cueing you into the emotional beats.
Mm-hmm.
In this, but like not. Sometimes that can be overbearing for movies. Like I felt like it was overbearing in The Color Purple.
Like
Which
it's
wasn't
like
John
almost
Williams, but
trying to manipulate you.
yeah,
You know
but
what I mean?
but when John Williams does it, like in E.T. and in this movie, it it for some reason I'm okay with it. It just feels right. I don't know if that's just John Williams
That's how I
magic or
feel.
what, but
That's how I feel about a lot of Hans Zimmer scores. I
sure,
feel
yeah,
like are just he just perfectly nails like the emotional energy
yeah,
of the scene. And I think that I think for me, John Williams, I think a lot of times does a lot of like a lot of his themes like really suit. It's hard to think of John Williams outside of like Indiana Jones
mm-mm.
or Jaws or Star Wars um or say the one I'm thinking of. It's like Superman,
Yeah,
right? Like these like very like these heroic themes that I feel like really suit the character really really well.
yeah,
And I think it's sometimes easy to forget that he also does movies like this where he's
right,
doing something a lot more subtle, where he's really just trying to let the music accentuate as opposed to something like Star Wars where it's like almost as much of a character,
right.
you
Hmm.
know, um,
Like the themes
as
get tied to the characters. Yeah,
right. And so a movie like this, it's like the music's really just there to complement
yeah.
what's happening. And there were a couple moments, I mean, that I was like, oh wow, I'm really like I think it's towards the beginning. There's like this one like central theme that kind of pops up that I was
There's
like,
that Welsh
I need to go look
lullaby.
up the score. Yeah,
It's called Suo Guan or some Suo Gon.
do you know if that was Christian Bale singing at any point in the
I'm
movie?
not sure, to be honest. I didn't come across that in my research.
Okay.
Um, but I mean, it might have been. I really don't know. I'm curious now that you asked that. Um, but yeah, it's a Welsh lullaby, and he's Welsh, so maybe
Hmm.
maybe it was him. I don't know. Um, but yeah, and it kind of, if I'm remembering right, it kind of bookends the film with that lullaby.
Yeah.
So and it's really beautiful. Like it's beautifully used in the movie.
Well, it's kind of it's kind of interesting to see.
It feels very different at the beginning than at the end.
Right. Well, it represents um some of his transition.
Yeah.
Right. Like I love how like he's in church singing with the choir, and then like
Uh-huh.
there's that scene at the party where he's like, "Oh, I'm an atheist,"
Yeah.
And I love how the one guy's like, "Oh, your boy tells me that he's an atheist." Apparently, and the dad's
Yeah.
like, "I always figured he was." And
Yeah.
like, it's very interesting how it's just very nonchalant. They're just like, "Yeah, whatever." But
Yeah.
anyway, but then at the end of it, which again, like, kind of getting back into like this attempt at trying to like humanize Japanese characters, but I don't know
Sure.
if they
Yeah.
really do it well. Where you see that he's got like this reverence and respect specifically for the pilots,
Mm-hmm.
and so as they're like drinking the tea, which if you know anything about history, like that's like the kamikaze ritual,
Right.
like that
Mm-hmm.
these men are flying out and they're not supposed to come back,
Right.
and so he starts to sing it for them in a very authentic way. Like I feel like
Mm-hmm.
he's kind of, I don't know, it's interesting. And I love the shot of the sergeant, the hard ass sergeant who's like tearing up a little bit,
Yeah. Yeah.
like, which that whole dynamic is very interesting as
Yeah.
well. Like
It's a
at the end where
really,
he's like hard boy, and then he just moves on. I don't know. It's weird.
yeah. It's a like strangely touching sequence. It's weird. It like, cause it is that aspect of like his fascination with the Japanese, airmen is very like strange, but when you step out, like it makes sense because of his like a lack of ties to anything Western, really. Um, but
That's fair.
like that scene is like strangely touching because it does these inserts of different people like looking on to his kind of, it's almost like his last bit of innocence,
Yeah, I
in a
was literally
way.
about yeah.
And everyone's watching on, and really from that point on, like he's his innocence kind of goes to the wayside. I feel like to a
Yeah.
certain degree.
Which
But
this is kind of a on the whole topic of like the cinematography. I really do love the way that they shot the sequence at the end where he's in the reunification
yeah.
tent with all the other kids,
Mm-hmm.
because I couldn't really remember how exactly it happened. I thought that maybe he was sitting, he wasn't even expecting his parents to come. But I like how they like kind of start to pan across the crowd, and like you see all the kids and they all just look pretty normal.
Yeah.
Like they all look like normal, sophisticated British children. And then like you at first you only see like a little segment of his face,
Uh-huh.
and then as it continues to pan over, you just see these sullen eyes.
Yeah.
I mean, this kid has been through hell and back,
Yeah.
and he obviously is completely different than all the other kids around him. And I love it. His parents literally pass him up at first.
Yeah. Yeah.
They don't even recognize him,
Mm-hmm.
which was crazy. But I think there's a lot to be said there. But I really did love the way that sequence was shot as
Oh,
well,
yeah.
where you just also, I think,
Great
again,
camera
talking
work.
about
Yeah.
the costuming in that moment as well. Everyone else is in kind of like white kind of colors,
Mm-hmm.
like very bright colors. And then again, not only is he like dirty with his salt sunken eyes, he's wearing like the black coat,
Mm-hmm.
like the leather bomber jacket.
Right.
And so even that way, he like really stands out from the rest of the crowd as well. And again, I think it's something that they kind of do, throughout the film is they do a good job of making him feel separate, especially when he's in these crowd shots where he would be very easily lost.
Yeah.
They do a good job of like kind of keeping your eyes' attention on him, for sure.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's one of those like just like expertly like the composition and the way the camera moves through the scene is just like is something that Spielberg does so like when he's tuned in, like his scene composition and his like ability to like move the camera like exactly how it should be moved through the scene is just so good. But yeah, so they just wrapping up this this portion of the show today. They finished production slightly ahead of schedule.
It's always a win.
Yeah, always a win. The budget, I don't know how much. It seems like the budget they were either like really full or like maybe went a little over. I'm not sure, but slightly ahead of schedule is a big deal. Spielberg at this point is pretty good about that. Unlike earlier in his career. But Ballard really loved the movie. He was active in the marketing for the movie, and it released on Christmas Day, 1987, December 25th. I think it had a earlier in December release for New York, Los Angeles, but the wide release was Christmas Day.
Which it's kind of crazy to think of a movie, especially one shot on film with such a quick turnaround, considering they had just shot this. Like, that's especially a movie this long,
Mm-hmm.
and not that it's a blockbuster, but coming from someone like Spielberg, because I mean nowadays the turnaround on a movie is
it's long.
pretty close. It can usually be about a year is pretty normal.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you think like Lisa Frankenstein, we shot in November 2022, I think, and that just came out in February.
Yeah.
Now again, I think with that one, I think they edited like 2 versions of it. But it's usually only the lower budget stuff that is that quick turnaround. Like I think one of the first movies I worked on was a movie called Black and Blue, which is like a really bad ripoff of Training Day by a guy named Deon Taylor. Not that he's ever going to listen to this necessarily, but if he does, shout out to you. He's a cool guy. But that movie, I think we shot in February and it came out in October. So even then, it's like 6 months. Or so.
It seems
that quick of a turnaround is pretty.
It seems like
pretty
Spielberg
abnormal.
was doing that these days, because Color Purple was similar. It was shot in like the spring and summer and came out in December.
I mean, I guess at this point, he's probably gotten to a point where he's shooting what he wants to shoot.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't have a lot of extra stuff to go through.
Also, he's done every movie since Close Encounters, save E.T. with Michael Kahn, his editor, and so they're probably
that
just
probably
like,
helps too.
just
He already
tuned
kind
in.
of
he
already kind of knows what Spielberg's like sensibilities are. So that's obviously that's definitely super helpful as well. I'm sure, but
editing is huge for putting these. I mean, like I've said it before on the podcast, and I'll say it again, but like editing, the way a movie is edited together is like almost just as important as how it was directed, and so
the movie. You see the I was watching a video essay recently about something, and it was like the amount of change a movie can go through in the script writing, the filming, and the editing phase is actually almost exactly the same.
Yeah.
Like the amount of tweaks and the amount of things you can move around in all 3 portions is almost the same.
Yeah.
Which is really crazy to think about. But like you can completely restructure a movie in the edit.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, no one will be the wiser if they didn't know about it. So yeah, that's definitely true.
Yeah. Well, yep, they got it out Christmas Day. Which I don't know that I would want to watch this movie on Christmas Day.
It's not a Christmas Day movie.
But yeah,
but that's still a thing that happens nowadays. Is like award season.
Yeah, that kind of like
didn't
prestige drama film.
Didn't the Iron Claw come out on Christmas Day? It was right around Christmas Day.
I'm not sure, honestly.
I'm pretty sure it was. It was a phenomenal movie. Depressing as hell,
as a movie. Yeah,
phenomenal though. I was
well
so
made,
mad
but I walked out.
It should have gotten
like,
a Best Picture nom, or Zac Efron should have got Best Actor. But
I think I think I shouted him out in I did an episode where I did my own kind of my own nominations, and I don't.
All I have to say, there's always got to be at least one like depressing holiday season movie.
Yes. Yeah, so they had I think around a $25 million budget on this. I've been getting like different numbers for box office. So like for some reason the book I'm using is always like a decent amount higher than what I'm finding on Box Office Mojo. But also like I saw the same number from a different source as in the book. I saw
I feel like the book would probably be pretty reliable.
66 million is what the book says. And I saw that somewhere else too, just when you Google it. But Box Office Mojo said 22 million domestic. So I don't
Well,
know.
like, maybe 66 was like during its entire run, like
Yeah,
in domestic and international,
yeah, and it
like
said it
total
didn't
box
really have
office.
much for international on box. So maybe they just don't have those numbers for Box Office Mojo. But yeah,
Yeah, so
66
I would just
million.
assume that 66 is like total box
Yeah,
office, like regardless of domestic or
yeah.
not.
So I mean, technically, like this is financially like a pretty decent movie, but like for
I'm
Spielberg,
surprised it was only $25 million. Like
yeah,
you think the budget would have been higher?
yeah. I mean, for Spielberg, this is like not a very big success. Like for a lot of people, 66 million on a $25 million budget, like pretty good. But for Spielberg, not so much. I would say. Um, and the reception was similar. The press was pretty lukewarm. Like critics actually preferred John Borman's Hope and Glory, released at a similar time, that also had like a kid perspective of war. Um,
I have to watch that one.
Yeah, I've never seen that one. So,
So I'm gonna be honest.
yeah,
The press ain't the only one that's lukewarm about it.
yeah, yeah. We'll get there. Some lead critics saw it as a major leap forward for Spielberg. Janet Maslin of the New York Times said it was unforgettable. Andrew Sars of the Village Voice said he said it was the best of the year. But then like the results from the audience reception just wasn't as good. It seems like it might have been something to do with going to a Spielberg movie and expecting one thing, but getting something different. Because Spielberg has a reputation at this point, and this movie is not like the uplifting, sentimental. It has its moments of that, but like overall, just the story doesn't allow for you
I'm
to
just trying. I'm
go
trying to
down
think.
that route.
This seems like it's kind of his first like non genre slash blockbuster film.
Yeah,
This
I
is his
mean, you
first
have
time trying to
the
do.
Color Purple was definitely like a prestige drama. That was like
That was based on a play, though, right?
it was based on a book too.
Or okay, okay,
Yeah,
okay. I thought there was a stage play or something. Maybe that was
the
after.
play came around. The Broadway musical came around in 2005. So,
Okay.
yeah, yeah. So he did the Color Purple and then followed it up with this. So they're two kind of like more prestige drama. The Color Purple being a very different story, obviously, but this is kind of a prestige war drama film. So it just like has a different tone than people are used to from Spielberg movies. And Myra Forsberg, a critic of the, said about on that note, she said, "quote a movie with grown-up themes and values, although spoken through a voice that hadn't changed through puberty yet." That was interesting. Roger Ebert, I know, felt similarly lukewarm about it, which I love. Roger Ebert. Always like to see what he says. I also always like to see what Pauline Kael says. She
Mhm.
was a big critic for the New Yorker back then, and uh, she the reason I like her is because her takes are always like very strong. Like she just, if she doesn't like it, she digs into it. If she loves it, she like praises it. And there's
Tells it how it is.
a little bit of in between, but she takes a side, which I love it. But I wrote down a long quote from her because I thought it was very interesting. This is a quote: "Empire of the Sun begins majestically and stays strong for perhaps 45 minutes. It's so gorgeously big you want to laugh in pleasure. Steven Spielberg takes over Shanghai and makes it his city. It's swarming with people, all doing his bidding as the camera moves around the tops of stately buildings to the streets below. And then, first in brief patches and then in longer ones, his directing goes terribly wrong. Working on an enormous scale and with a large theme, he throws himself into bravura passages, lingers over them, trying to give them a poetic obsessiveness, and loses his grasp of the narrative. For the sake of emotion, to have something to say, to give the picture meaning, he pumps it full of false emotion. That's what his poetry is." It's like, dang. Colin Kael going in on Empire of the Sun.
I don't necessarily disagree
Yeah,
with
it
anything
sounds
she said.
similar to what your take is. I feel a little differently. I guess I'm more warm than lukewarm on this movie. So we'll get into that. But just wrapping up awards wise, it got 6 Oscar nominations for cinematography, art direction, costume design, sound, editing, and the score by John Williams. 6 nominations, and guess who, ironically, it lost all 6 of those to? None other than
The arch nemesis.
the last emperor, who technically did beat them to shooting in the People's Republic of China.
Can you imagine the audacity of like that movie shooting in China before this movie? They tried to market this movie as like the first Western film shot in the People's Republic of China, only for the last emperor to sweep them at the Oscars.
Yes.
I mean,
just man,
lots of egg on the face in that movie for sure.
Yes. You know, I didn't look at the full list of like acting nominations, but I was like, man, honestly, like the Christian Bale performance in this like feels worthy of like a nomination. It feels like something the Academy would typically like recognize. But they also like probably weren't at a point where they were doing a whole lot of like child actor nominations back then.
They still don't. I mean,
yeah, they still don't.
It's pretty rare for anyone like underage to like get nominated, no matter how good their performance is.
But to me, it's his performance is worthy of like at least consideration. Like it's a really good performance, and it's in and it's a performance in a movie that the Academy, the type of movie the Academy would typically go for, you know. So, but yeah, that's like the production, the results of the movie.
Hello again. Do you know how you can really support the show for free in just a few minutes or less? That's right. Just leave a rating and review on Spotify and Apple, or wherever you listen that might allow for ratings and reviews. These really help the visibility of the podcast. In fact, just hit that pause button right now and drop the review right now. And then you can get back to the show. I'd greatly appreciate it. Okay, I trust that you went and left that rating and review now. Back to the show.
Let's dig more into some key aspects of the movie. I did want to talk briefly about the history. We've touched on a little bit of this, but like kind of like high level view of it. So Shanghai had tons of Western influence before the war. It was called the Paris of the East. And Westerners really like took advantage of, there was pretty like loose government regulation and oversight in China at the time. There wasn't a strong state presence, which probably has a lot to do with how the Japanese so easily like, you know, kind of took occupation there. And then like after the war, like the Westerners kind of just vanished along with their influence. So that's why you have like a lot of, I mean, like, so you have like those shots of like the huge Gone with the Wind poster in the movie. And that's like very true to what it was like in Shanghai. You got the European architecture that we talked about. It's just very much like, it was kind of like the capitalist center of the East at the time.
Right.
And then I think
that in Hong Kong for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And then so I think the Japanese started doing some occupation starting, I think, even back to 1931. But the officially 1937 is when it really like goes into strong effect. But what was crazy was, and you see this at the beginning of the movie, the inner. I think this is all good to know because when you watch the movie, you don't necessarily like it doesn't teach you these things, and so you kind of have to try to figure it out. That might be something that the movie could have done a little bit better of doing. It has like the opening narration crawl, but still you're kind of like, wait, so what's going on? But basically, there was an international settlement within Shanghai after the 1937 invasion. So Japan was already occupying the city of Shanghai, and then there was this like basically city within the city where all the international settlements, and the Japanese basically just kind of left them alone. They didn't want to aggravate, aggravate any of the European or American people that were there. So they just kind of let them be. So they really were still living their like lush lifestyle, all the while like the Chinese are, the Japanese have already like kind of taken over the rest of Shanghai, and the Chinese people outside of that settlement are suffering already. And it was like that for 4 years. Because they didn't start imprisoning the Westerners until after Pearl Harbor, which happens in 1941. And so for 4 years, you have, just like you see in the movie, like they're going through checkpoints to go, to different parts of, Japanese free places. And then, after Pearl Harbor, thousands of Westerners were imprisoned.
So I guess I got a little confused because there's a scene where when they're at the Halloween party, and he runs out into the field. He finds the downed Zero, and he comes across the soldiers. Were those Japanese soldiers or Chinese soldiers?
Those are Japanese soldiers, and it's kind of like indicating, okay, something's coming. They're getting ready to. They're kind of closing in and getting ready to do the full-on invasion of even the international settlement.
Because I remember seeing, I saw that part, and I'm like, I thought like they were trying to imply they were Japanese soldiers, but I was like, but no one seems overly concerned.
Yeah,
these guys are just camping out. They built like an entire bunker for themselves, like not that far away from this house.
Yeah, well, because like I think there was this like mutual kind of like, hey, the Japanese were kind of like, hey, we know y'all are Westerners and we don't want to start anything with y'all. Yeah. And there was kind of this mutual like, that's why they kind of like are calling him back, and like,
run.
The Japanese kind of stay to themselves and they stay to themselves, and it's kind of like this mutual like, y'all do your thing, we'll do our thing. We're not that worried that you're oppressing the Chinese. We kind of are too.
The movie doesn't really give you a great, like you said, doesn't really explain that too well.
And
sure.
And some aspects are like accurate, and some like aren't quite as accurate. There's a really good episode of a podcast that I listened to. I'm trying to remember what the name of the podcast is. It is called Service on Celluloid. But it is it's a podcast that's put on by the National World War II Museum, which is actually in New Orleans.
Yeah.
They have this podcast called Service on Celluloid, and basically like they look at movies that depict World War II and talk about it from like a history perspective, like what's accurate, what's not, what perspective does the movie give you. They give you context. It was a really interesting episode to listen to, so I'll try to link that in the episode notes so that people can go listen to that if they're interested in it.
Sounds like something I'd like to listen to as well.
For sure. I need to look up this this podcast in general, because when I come across other World War II movies, it'll be probably interesting to hear that, like the historical aspect. And I'm scrolling through. I mean, they have like, seems like maybe over 40 episodes.
Oh wow!
So, Mrs. Miniver, which is a movie I watched recently, they have episodes. So, yeah, I need to go back and I got a Casablanca episode. Um, yeah, they have a lot of stuff on here. So yeah, that would be really interesting to listen to some of those, the historical context for those. But yeah, I'll try to remember to link that in the episode notes for everyone. But yeah, you can look it up if I don't forget. But yeah, so I just thought it was like, this feels like a really like interesting, unique perspective of the war. Like it's a part of the war that you don't really hear about a whole lot. Kind of the war, what the effects that it had on China. I mean, there's like, I think the like really conservative number that's probably way off for
Propagandized.
for Chinese deaths is like 14 million.
Mhm.
It was probably way more than that. I think that's like the conservative number, which is wild. Just like terrible. But yeah, I mean, I guess moving on, Spielberg distinctives were, I have a few written down in the notes, but was there anything that was like, when you watched it, you were like, oh yeah, that's Spielberg. This is,
I mean, yeah, just those kind of really,
we
nice like tracking shots, the
Mhm.
wide shots.
that we already talked about. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, like those are all
The
very
silhouettes
distinctive
is
to
what
the
gets
style.
me. I'm starting to realize that like the silhouette shot is like the Spielberg shot at this point. Like, that man cannot have a movie without a silhouette shot. Well, multiple silhouette shots. He loves them. And yeah, I another thing that I noticed he likes to do that I really think is is a is an interesting way to have a character come into frame, instead of like moving the camera to like onto the character to put them in frame. He has the character like enter the frame, like a still frame. He does that a decent amount, and sometimes it's like a more medium shot that he does that in, but sometimes it's like a close up, like a character will step into close up. And I think it's just it's just an interesting way to like do something different with the camera, and usually like it's to add something to the character too. It's not just
Yeah.
like to have a cool shot, but like, go, like, I think there's a point where like Jim steps into frame and it's like a low angle and it's looking up at him in the sky, and like there's this like, I can't remember exactly what's going on, but I remember having the feeling that like there was purpose behind him having it like a low angle looking up at him, and having the sky as the background as he's like stepping into
Yeah.
frame. But yeah.
Yeah, and maybe not so much a Spielberg distinctive. I think some of his movies he does this, but there's a lot of really good usage of insert shots in
Yeah.
this film.
Yeah, I
You know?
agree. The standout to me, I think, is the stadium, like with all the stuff. Like he does a lot of inserts throughout that.
Oh
Like,
yeah, whenever talking about like a very Spielbergian shot is where the camera kind of focuses on the little decal on the top of the car,
mhm.
and it focuses on that, and then like you kind of see Jamie like come into frame,
Yep.
and it kind of shifts to him
Mhm.
realizing that's his family's car.
Yep. Mhm. Or at least
That's like
like,
a really good moment.
or at least like the same type of car that his family had,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, it's really good.
I think there's also a lot to be said about like they bring all the British socialites to that stadium, and like it's all the things that represent their copious wealth just sitting out rotting, so to speak.
Visually, it's a very like strong point in the film, I think. A very like striking visual. And that's in the book too. I don't know if that's like a thing that, it's one of those things where it's hard to like know like what's fact and what's fiction. because it's Ballard talks about how like it's just based on experiences, not really like necessarily true. But yeah, that's in the book too. He spends some time there. It seems like in the movie it might be like a little bit more like there might be a little bit more to it than it seems like in the book. There's maybe less. There's a lot of stuff there and a lot of furniture and cars and stuff. But in the movie, it seems like it's like jam packed full of stuff, and I didn't really get that sense in the book. Um, but yeah, it's interesting. The other like Spielberg distinctive, it's just like one sequence that I think it stands out in is like tension building, a specific type of tension building, which is like very little is happening, but there's so much tension, and it's what the marsh scene that we've talked about a couple of times, where Sergeant Agata's like looking, sees the shoes, and he's like looking in the marshes, and Jim is hiding behind the reeds and stuff, and there's like
then it cuts to all the Americans taking bets on if he's gonna live or die.
And yeah, it's just like very, very strong tension building that Spielberg is really good at. That you kind of see, like even in a movie like The Color Purple, you get that as Celie is like going to shave Mister's neck, and like there's this like tension building with you can see that she's thinking about doing something else with the razor, and but yeah, he just knows how to work that. It's like it's like with the camera he's building the tension, even though there's not a whole lot going on in the frame somehow. It's just really, really impressive. Yeah.
Hello there, listener. Don't you ever want more for your life? Don't you ever dream of surpassing the status of just podcast listener? Well, I've got good news. If you head on over to establishingshotpod.com and click the send a voicemail button on the right side of your screen, you can be featured on the podcast. I'd love to hear from you, whether it's a comment in response to an episode you liked, an opinion of mine you disagreed with, or just a question for me. And if you're too shy to have your voice featured, you can always email me at establishingshotpod@gmail.com. Don't settle for just being a podcast listener. Reach for the stars and get featured on The Establishing Shot. Back to the show.
Yeah, we've talked a little bit about like some standout images, sequences. But yeah, what you've mentioned the clowns in the car. What are some other like really standout, like whether it's like an image or maybe even like a whole sequence that just like really stood out to you? Maybe like something that was good, or maybe even something that you thought was like not very well done, just like that stood out to you.
Yeah, I mean, I like the sequence. There's a couple off the top of my head, a couple of scenes that I really like. I like the scene where they're kind of in the first camp and that hangar or of some sort, and James just having a really bad time of it. He gets knocked over. The lady throws the water in his face.
Yeah.
But the scene that really, in that moment that really stuck out to me is whenever, is it Bazzy? Is that his name?
Basie,
right?
yeah.
Basie's trying to take that lady's shoes. He's like, "What are you doing?" He's like, "Oh, they're about your size." He's like, "No, I don't want her shoes. Like, leave her alone."
Yeah.
That scene's really interesting. I love, of course, the marsh sequence where the sergeant's like hunting it. We just talked about is great. Almost gives me like it's almost like a brief little flash to like Vietnam. Reminds me of like the Predator with Arnold, like crawling through the mud and everything. Like it's interesting. I do think the relationship he has with the young boy, I guess soldier, who works with the pilots is interesting. The sequence kind of when he shows back up at the airfield, which I think one of the things that gets a little confusing about the movie is like the passage of time. There's a couple of really good
Yeah.
subtle ways that they do it though. Like I like towards the beginning, he gets back to his house, and like when he first gets to the house, there's a shot of the pool,
Mm-hmm.
and you see it like pretty full,
Yeah.
and it's covered in leaves. And then the next time we see the shot, the pool is like halfway full, which is a really good way of showing the passage
Right.
of
It's
time.
slowly
And then we see
draining.
it again, and it's almost empty.
And that's in the
You
book
know,
too. Like
Mhm.
he's really using. So like I listened to the book, and what I noticed when I was listening to, I was about halfway through the book when I watched the movie. And what I noticed when I was listening to the book is I would hear him describe something, and I was like, oh, that's a very strong visual representation. I can't wait to see, what Spielberg does with that visual like
Mhm.
representation of something. And that was one of the things that like I had already listened to in the book, and when I saw it in the movie, I was like, oh, there we go. Like a good
Nice.
example of
That's
like
cool.
taking something like that in the book is described, that you can picture, and like using it in a meaningful way, like visually in the movie. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and again, like another really good example of this is like, this movie almost has like three acts, like
Yeah.
very distinctively.
Yeah.
Like most movies have three acts.
Well,
but
there's 3 parts in the book, so
okay, that makes sense then.
Yep.
So I love kind of the end of the first part, and then when we do the pan over to like our new and improved Jamie with like the really bad haircut,
Yeah.
and
yeah,
he's no longer wearing like his British schoolboy
right.
outfit.
Mhm.
Like he's he's a little more frazzled. And then again, they kind of almost do the same thing a second time, but this time we see him all decked out in his like American clothes. He starts walking through the camp while smoking a
Yeah.
cigar
Those
some
aviators.
sort, and just very very interesting. But yeah, I think there's just a lot of really good of those really good individual moments. Like there's some really good passage of time scenes, but also like I was saying with the the kamikaze kid, so to speak, like the sequence where he shows back up at the airfield, which it was a little confusing as far as like how much time had passed in
Yeah.
this instance, because it's like, okay, so we got brought to the field or to the arena, and then he's been wandering around for at least a couple days at least.
Yeah.
And I guess it's like they don't really do a good job of explaining like how far he was moved. I guess he was close enough to where he was able to like drag a parachute full of food back
Yeah.
over to the internment camp, finds his buddy, and then the scene where that kid gets shot because they think he's about to slice him with the sword.
Mhm.
That man, that's rough. And I love how
Yeah.
the guy starts running towards him. He's like, "You bastard!" and like throws him in the water, and he's getting rough. This kid's about to drown this man, and like
Yeah.
just really shows you how much he's had to grow into a
Mhm.
fighter and a survivor, as opposed to when we first meet him, where you're just like, man, this is like the most stuck up kid I've ever met in my entire life.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, and we can jump into Jim before we get back to like some other really, really great sequences. Since we're talking about him, I noted some things about Jim. Like, so, I mean, you have one of the things I wrote down is survival. Like, you start off with Jim, and like his first instinct is to surrender, which I think it's kind of comical, but very like innocent. It shows his innocence. He's just like, oh, I'm supposed to surrender. I need to just go ahead and surrender. I don't need to be alone. Let me go ahead and surrender to the Japanese. And then he's like, man, surrendering's really hard. Which I thought was, he kind of talks about that in the book, which is funny to me. But the Japanese just kind of like laugh at him. They're just like, get away. And I guess it's probably like, why would we take this kid? Like he's going to be more of a hassle to us than anything. But yeah, but then it gets to the point where he's just kind of like the middleman, like of the camp. He's like, he grows to a point where like you were talking about in the warehouse or hangar or whatever, he's like, no, don't take her shoes. He's getting water thrown in his face. And then like we jump to later in the movie in the camp, and he's like running. He's basically like running everything. He's making all the trades.
They have a really good
Um,
insert shot of the golf shoes
yeah.
when he walks to the hospital.
Mm-hmm.
And like I like how he's like really subtle about he grabs the glass bottle and like pops the cork off and kind of pushes it back over. He does it in a way in which the doc doesn't really notice, but they also kind of have that insert shot where it's like from his perspective looking at like the fancy golf
Yep.
shoes, and like
Mm-hmm.
he's just become a very different person
Yeah.
already. One thing I was just thinking of, that I wonder if it was possibly a mistake of some sort, because it's not really addressed, is between the hangar and the internment camp, where they have the whole sequence at the truck
Mm-hmm.
where Basie gets picked to get to the truck, and he immediately starts trying to befriend the other kids, and like is basically just trying to. And it's really weird how like he intentionally ignores Jamie,
Yeah.
but then literally like 2 seconds later, he like tells the other British people, "I'm taking care of this kid for his dad."
Uh-huh.
So Jamie basically forces himself into it by trying to tell the guy where to go.
Uh-huh.
But there's a shot where he gets like picked up and like kind of kicked around, and then he gets into the back of the truck and he's like pointing the way, and like his forehead is like bleeding,
Yeah.
like just for like 2 seconds. But like no one says anything. He doesn't seem to be overly injured, but I guess it's implied that they hit him on the head hard enough to like break this, like maybe break the skin a little bit and
Yeah.
bleed. But I was like, was there something missing there that I
I
didn't
think
catch? I
I think
didn't
he like
understand.
knocked him back with like the butt of his gun, maybe in his
Yeah,
forehead. But
I don't know.
yeah.
It was just one of those things where it's like it felt like it was almost like maybe an editing mistake or something that
Yeah.
like because no one really addresses it, but that it was something I noticed.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. What I do know is that the way Ballard puts Jim's survival is that he had a very unsentimental education,
Hmm.
which makes totally sense. But Ballard also said he talks about how people would ask him like about his memory of being in the camp, and he would kind of tell people like, I actually like remember being quite happy um for the most part in the camp. And he kind of talks about how children like can survive quite cheerfully in situations like that, which is very interesting, like psychologically, like probably very interesting to dig into that deeper. I'm not a psychologist though, so
Well, I mean, they're firstly, it's a civilian camp.
yeah.
It's not a combatant camp,
Yeah.
so you're going to treat those kind of prisoners very, very differently
Yeah.
because you're not expecting them to have the skill set to fight back. Because they most likely just want to survive. They just
Right.
want to live as normal of a life as possible.
Mhm.
And you also don't have the same element of like ethnic cleansing as you saw with like the Nazi camps for the Jewish
Yeah.
people and things like that. So, so I can like so it's interesting to hear him say that like, oh, children can survive, quite happily in situations like this, because I think the same could not be said for the Nazi concentration camps,
Yeah.
where
And I think
children were.
I think
were
even
killed.
the adults in this camp, one of the things like the adults in the film are largely like
Left alone.
fleeting presences. They're almost like Walking Dead.
Yeah.
They're like Jim is pretty full of life, and a lot of the adults just
Can't stand it.
yeah, they can't stand him, and I think it's because of that. I think it's because they see how full of life he is, and they're very like just depressed and defeated by the situation.
Like there's that one scene where we get with him and the victors, and
Yeah.
he's like asking all these questions. She's like, "Strange child,"
Yeah.
and that shuts him up real quick.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very interesting. His childlike understanding of war, we've touched on some, and I think a lot of it comes down to just like admiring bravery, like for him as a child, especially like with no ties to being British. There's a point where someone says like, remember you're British, and he's like, I've never been there. um but like especially with that, and then on top of that, just like being a kid, um when you see bravery, you're just like, oh, that's a hero. It doesn't matter if they're Japanese or American or what. um and Ballard even said in the documentary, he said small boys tend to find their heroes where they can. and I think that's
The bar.
true here.
That's a bar right there.
Yeah. And unfortunately,
Put that on a shirt.
sometimes they find them in guys like Basie, who are scumbags, but yeah. And Basie kind of acts as like his surrogate father in a way, even though he doesn't want to be. Like Jim still sees him in that way, and it's hard because like he's very cold towards Jim. They do have like one moment where this is the reason I can't totally write off the Basie character, because like he does reassure Jim in ways that like he doesn't have to. In certain moments, like giving him hope for his parents, finding his parents, giving him hope, for them surviving. Like he doesn't have to be that for Jim, but he is. And so, it's for the most part, he's kind of a scumbag, but then there's a few moments that are like, okay, this dude isn't totally 100% like just bad and terrible.
I mean,
But,
sure,
yeah.
but he also tries to cut Jim loose at every opportunity.
No, I'm totally.
Like I love what Jim
get that,
goes to visit him in the hospital, and they're having like this heart to heart, and then all of a sudden Basie's like, "Wait, why are you here? You're supposed to be watching my stuff." And he's like, "Well, they were all bigger than me."
Yeah.
Right. And he like gets out the hospital, he finds all the stuff gone, and then of course like Jim is just absolutely heartbroken when he realizes that Basie and Dainty left without him.
Yeah.
He's like, "Oh, he promised, and I'm just like, dude, I mean, like you said, like Ballard said, little boys tend to find their heroes where they can, and sometimes your hero is someone like Basie, as much as they will continuously let you down.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Going back to image, like intriguing, like images or sequences, the opening of this movie is very interesting. It's just like water, and then you see some flowers, and then you see some coffins, and it's just like, what other Spielberg film up to this point has opened with such a like strange, horrifying, and beautiful juxtaposition? Like this is very different as an opening for Spielberg. So that opening shot really stood out to me. Because it's something very like, I guess especially for me, like going through this series, we're nearing the end of the 80s. You've got two more movies basically after this in the 80s. And this is a very unique opening shot for a Spielberg film. Like there hasn't been one like this up to this point. So it just really stood out to me.
Well, especially because it's like you see the flowers, you see the coffins. One of them's like open. You see like some kind of
corpse
corpse that's pretty decomposed for the most part. And then you see like a military boat just. I'm pretty sure it was the British Navy. It looked like it was just sailing on through. Could care less about trying to avoid hitting them. Just right over it. And so it's definitely meant to kind of draw the viewer in as far as like, what could this mean?
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. Another thing I really there's a couple of things earlier on that I thought were great. One of them is leading up to his plane landing in the bunker with the Japanese that you talked about at the party. But before that, he's like throwing it up in the sky, and this like toy glider plane is like flying around in the wind, and he's found this downed plane and is like pretending to shoot at it and stuff. And that whole sequence is just like really incredibly shot, and it's one of the like leaning towards fantastical sides of the movie, because like the way that the glider toy plane like flies around is like so unrealistic.
A little too perfect. Yeah.
It's like perfectly like fighting with him, in his in the cockpit of this downed plane.
But I love that that's
yeah.
a reoccurring motif as well, though, like the glider, because then later
Yeah.
on, that's how he first befriends the Japanese boy as well, is the glider situation.
So I thought that was really cool. One of the most powerful visual moments in the film to me was when he goes back to the house and he goes in his parents' room, and there's insert shots of, like, at first he sees, so there's all the powder everywhere. I guess it's like a makeup powder maybe. And at first he sees like a footprint that looks like, oh, it's his mom's footprint. And you can see that he's like reassured at first. But then he keeps scanning along the room and he starts to see boot prints and kind of like finger marks that look like, scratching, like trying to cling to something from the like in the powder marks.
Someone's being dragged away, yeah.
And it doesn't explain anything. You're putting the pieces together with Jim as he's looking at it. And I thought that was like just incredibly well done.
And he opens the window to
and it
let the wind
blows it.
He's like, I don't want to look at it anymore. Yeah, no, that sequence was great.
Oh yeah,
just the way it was edited, where it kind of keeps stacking the inserts,
right?
And like you said, like it's literally pretty much directly from his perspective, as he's kind of realizing what he's seeing as well, and then he's like, I don't want to look at it anymore. Which it was great,
really great. There's Jim saluting to the Japanese airmen. I think is really like beautiful shot with the sparks flying, and they salute him back. I think that's a really beautiful shot. There is the atom bomb flash, which is really interesting. It's a moment where Mrs. Victor is dying, and you can tell he thinks that it's like maybe her soul leaving her body, which they've kind of discussed some.
I think he kind of says that later in the movie.
I think he does. And then realizes that it was the atom bomb flash, which
I learned a new word today.
Yeah.
Atom bomb.
Moments like that where they reiterate, I guess, something with dialogue that you kind of already figured out that he thought just visually watching him experience it. I'm like, well, you didn't have to like go and reiterate it with dialogue, but hey, at the same time, I'm like, a kid probably would say that, so I guess it's kind of true to a kid, but the American air raid towards the end is really good. There's the moment where it like slows down and the pilot's like waving at Jim. And Spielberg was talking about that, and he said it's a kid's dream to have a soldier in combat like acknowledge their existence. And so that was like huge. That was like the most incredible thing that could have happened to him, is that pilot waving at him. Which I think feels very true to, that kid's perspective.
Well, again, like you said, like kids are very drawn towards perceived bravery, and so there's nothing braver than seeing someone, fighting essentially for your freedom, and for them to take a moment to recognize you. I mean, it kind of reminds you the same thing of like in a lot of superhero movies where you have the moment where it's like, the superhero catches the woman falling off the bridge, and she's just like, oh my gosh, thank you. I love that classic. There's a really good Family Guy bit where Peter gets rescued by Spider-Man, and he's like, oh, thank you so much, Spider-Man. We got to do it again sometime. Spider-Man's just like, everybody gets one, kid, and it just swings away. Like, but I think that's probably very similar to where like that kind of sequence is inspired by, is, just wanting recognition. Like, sometimes you want to be saved too. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think at this point now it's the Americans that are the bravest and the strongest. So now they're his new heroes, which is interesting. But yeah, that whole set piece was really good. They, obviously you have to like do a lot of planning to line up all the special effects and stuff. Because they're dropping dummy bombs out of the planes, and they have to like set the explosives off down below like just right to time it up. And in the making of doc, it was funny because like Christian Bale is like aware that he really needs to nail his performance, but then like he does it, and Spielberg's like, no, like that's not, you didn't quite do what I wanted you to do, and so they had to like do some extra shooting really quickly to still get like flames and smoke in the background before it died down, because it was kind of like a one take thing, it's, you can't really do it again.
Yeah, that's the kind of stuff you do at the end of shooting. It's kind of like one of the crazy stories I've heard. So I don't know if you're a big fan of like the Apes trilogy, like the most recent one. So in Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, they have a sequence where they shot like the apes encampment is on fire.
Yeah.
And I think I've heard they filmed some of that around Louisiana. Like that was like pre getting rid of the tax credits before the tax credits came back. So like the late thousands, early 2010s, like there was a lot of stuff being filmed around here. And I've heard that like the very last thing they did was basically that sequence, and they just actually set the set on fire. So that is something that people do sometimes. So so definitely when you have all this stuff getting blown up in a big sequence like that, that's like one of the last things you do, and you definitely want to try and just do it once and be done with it for sure.
Yeah, the other recent one that was great was the bridge collapsing in Temple of Doom at the end. They actually like built that bridge, and then they like exploded it. You have to, it's like one of those things where it has to like, you just have to hope you get the perfect stuff from that one take, because you can't like rebuild the bridge after that
too.
But yeah, I thought that was funny. Bill having to be like, oh, I'm sorry, Steven Spielberg, and I'll do better.
I'm sorry, Steven, can we do it again?
But right after that, I think the most like emotionally affecting part of the movie, to me was like him like saying like coming to the finally like admitting like he doesn't even remember what his parents look like.
He's almost like he's on a very emotional high.
Yeah, and he just like,
and all of a sudden it just hit, and like the doctor's up there yelling at him like, get off the roof, and just I forget what does the doctor say to him specifically.
I don't even remember. Yeah, he does.
He says something like, must you always like just be so much, or something like he's basically just telling like, you like, why do you always have to be like who, like the way that you are, or something along those lines. And it's just like it's like 3-4 years of grief just hits him all at once.
Yeah, and it's the
the transition is so good.
Oh yeah, the performance is like incredible. I may or may not have like gotten a little bit hazy in the eye for that.
Wife was cutting onions at that same exact time, right?
Yeah, there was cutting some onions somewhere. But yeah, just a really, really good, like you said, transition like from one emotion to the other. For that, the other standout like images you have, or sequences you have, like the killing of his Japanese friend.
It's not really an insert shot, but the shot of like he's holding the mango and you see the blood.
And
also I love the shot of when he's crawling through the marshes and they show everyone placing the bets, and you have the shot from the outside of the window and you see everyone in the window. That's a really good
I love that window. It's just it's such a good visually pleasing production design.
It's very Millennium Falcon.
Yes. For sure. When they killed his friend, it's different than, so like in the book there's not this like recurring kid popping up. So like I think that's something they add for visual effect in the movie that I think is actually like really well done. It kind of gives a thread that's not there in the book that I think is actually like really good. Showing like, because I mean it's like his counterpart on the other side of things.
Well, I mean,
And
the kid literally saves his
yeah, and
life,
they have like
essentially.
they have basically the same like little arc. They both like start off more innocent and like grow more and more like hardened and stuff. And yeah, I mean, the kid saves his life, and his grief over that is kind of defines like that final act.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and then like the last image that I thought was great was, well, not great. So this is one of those where I'm like, it's a good image. It's a little bit too on the nose. Maybe is the suitcase, throwing the suitcase into the water. It's like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, I get it. It's maybe a little too on the nose. I don't know. And that's like the last image of the film too, is the suitcase floating there, which I thought was an odd choice, like because you're going back to a visual that you already kind of used earlier,
Mm-hmm.
and so I didn't care for ending on that image necessarily, but oh well.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk a few major themes before we close things out. This one of the things, like as far as like for Spielberg goes, that I thought was interesting is it's kind of the opposite of the typical Spielberg approach. Spielberg is typically trying to like discover childhood and preserve childhood, and in this movie, it's like the death of his innocence in childhood. And yeah, I thought that was interesting. It's a way that Spielberg is starting to maybe explore some different thematic elements, some different
Mm-hmm.
ways of seeing things. You know, uh, Bell even like Bell commented on the end of the movie. He says he's kind of commenting on being like 15 years old by the end of the movie. You know, the character, obviously not Bell, but himself. But he said, quote, "By that point, I've just been through a lot. Life doesn't mean much to me anymore," unquote.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and
Yeah, and they
yeah,
do a really good job of kind of making him feel older. You know,
yeah,
obviously, even though the shooting was only a few months.
sure, yeah,
But just the schoolboy look versus how he looks towards the end of the film, they do a really good job of making him look aged up for sure.
yeah. Yeah, and we've talked about how like his parents don't even recognize him, and he doesn't even recognize them,
Yeah.
which I thought was funny. I was listening to another podcast that was talking about that sequence, and they were like, "I didn't even recognize the parents at first." I was like, are those the parents, or is that them?" And I felt the same
Well, I
way
like how
because
all the parents are.
you haven't seen them
Yeah.
for so long that like I literally actually did forget like what his parents looked like exactly. That when I saw
Yeah.
the dad, I was like,
Which
"Oh, that's the dad." But the mom, I was like, "Is that her?"
I wonder if that was an intentional choice.
Maybe so. Yeah,
You know, or just so kind of happened to be just a coincidental,
I think it.
matching of a theme.
Yeah, I think it's just. I think it. I don't know if it was an intentional choice. I think it's just the nature of like you've spent like, I mean, 3/4 of the movie without having seen
Mm-hmm.
them. Um,
Like basically almost like an hour and a half of the 2.5 hour
yeah,
runtime, if not
more than
close
that
to almost two
probably. Yeah,
hours.
you haven't even
Um,
seen them, and so you just kind of
yeah,
forget what they look like, just like Jim has forgotten what they look like. Um,
yeah.
yeah,
No, but that whole sequence is really good. I mean, I definitely agree. It's definitely like a lot of like coming of age movies. It definitely is about the death of innocence in
yeah.
a really real way.
Yeah, and in this movie, it's like, so, I mean, something that children do naturally is they kind of grow beyond their parents, is a way to describe it. They don't grow like, I mean, you could say grow out of, but I think growing beyond is maybe a better way because you grow beyond needing them and depending on them.
Hmm.
Um, and but in this situation specifically with him, him going like 4 years or so in an internment camp, it's like accelerated, and it's like, and it's growing beyond his parents in a more like wrenching and irreversible way. That's like, um, that you really feel the effects of in that sequence. Yeah.
Yeah, especially since they look relatively the same, so it's like
Yeah.
it almost starts to beg the question, like what did they have to go through,
Yeah.
if they even had to go through anything?
Yeah.
Like there's the implication that his mother may have been the one that was like drug out of the house, but for them to like not look much different, it's like,
Well,
okay, maybe they had like a much cushier experience, so to speak.
Yeah, either that or maybe they just like had gotten out sooner than he had. It could be that, and
But
already cleaned up and everything. But yeah, I just love all of that, and I feel like none of it feels like force fed. Yeah, which could easily be the case.
I mean, it's kind of the thing where it's like that has to happen, like in order for someone that young to survive without their parents going through a situation like that. Like they kind of have to force themselves to grow up exponentially faster, and kind of find their own way.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I mean, another like Spielberg aspect, I think too, that kind of goes in hand with this is the idea of a broken family, which he explores a lot in his movies in the 70s and 80s, and even like moving forward too. But like this is the first time where he's like really like applying that theme in a totally like literally foreign setting, in something that's like a totally different group of people, a totally different world, situation. So I thought that was interesting. The blending of fact and fiction, or reality and fantasy, is a big part of this. It obviously what attracted him to the movie in the first place, but yeah, it's having like adventure kind of injected and invented in this storyline is just really feels like in step with what Spielberg, like it's in his wheelhouse, and I think it comes through in this movie, and it helps it to, I don't know, it helps it to not be a different kind of movie that's even more like depressing and sad, because I don't think it should be that sort of movie, because it's from a child's perspective, and I'm just not so sure that a child would have like an utterly despairing perspective. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So yeah,
that's fair. Yeah.
Were there any other like thematic elements that, we've talked about coming of age? I feel like this is more of a coming of age story than a war story, to be honest.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. The war elements are few and far between.
Right.
And when they are there, I mean, I think, Spielberg has done much better in the war department. I mean, Saving Private Ryan, you got War Horse, you have a lot of other movies he's done where he's really tackled that subject much more directly. But yeah, I mean, I think that's really the strongest theme.
We've touched on them
throughout,
a lot of stuff
for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I did. Roger Ebert, one of the things he said in his review was he just didn't think the movie knew what it wanted to say. And I can see that. I think it's maybe just because what it's wanting to say is pretty simple. And it's just, because it doesn't end with like any sort of reassurance. It's more of just the question of like, well, okay, who is this boy going to be now? And that's just kind of like the point. It's not, there's not really necessarily like some strong point other than that question being presented. And I even think that could even be like a stand-in, like that personal question about Jim and what happened, like what will he be now, can even sort of be a stand-in for the different, like, bigger question of what will the world become now. You know, the wars ended. What okay, what becomes of this boy that we've spent all this time with? But the bigger
Right.
application, I guess, would be like, okay, so the war's over now. What does humanity do? Like, what do we do
Yeah.
as, you know, just human beings? You know,
Yeah.
so I think that's there. So I don't think the movie's trying to do much more than that, to be honest. Like, I think
Right.
maybe Ebert was trying to look for something deeper than that, but I don't know that it is trying to do anything deeper than that.
No, I mean, I get like you said it. I mean, it's really pretty much directly just a story of a young boy experiencing, death, grief,
Yeah.
famine,
So
and having to grow up very quickly.
yeah, for sure. So would you say like your like main problems with the film are just like the pacing of the second half? Is that what you would say?
I think my two biggest things with this movie. Well, I'll say three things.
Okay,
Number one, I feel like Spielberg is much more capable.
that's
I
fair.
don't feel like this movie. I don't think this movie is like the best, um, because he's done other like very intense dramas
Mhm.
that are much better showmanship of his particular skill set. You think like Schindler's List, you think
Right.
Saving Private Ryan, you think some of these movies. Those are movies that are a little bit later in his career, and maybe he felt a little more freedom in that. The other thing is like I do think it is pretty long for what it is.
Yeah,
I think
that's
there's
fair.
definitely some sequences that could have been. There's definitely some things that could have been condensed. That could have been cleaned up and a little more focused.
Mhm.
But I think the biggest issue I have with the movie is, and maybe this is part of it is because it is from a kid's perspective, so they didn't want to like push it too much. But I just don't really feel like it has an edge.
Yeah.
I feel like they could have
Yeah.
gone. I feel like if this movie was made today, they would have gone a lot darker, really shown you a lot more of like the horror of war,
Yeah.
or like the horrors of going through what he has to go through. And I think that would have kind of made a lot of these themes we've been talking about come through a lot stronger.
Mhm.
Because at the end of the day, it's like, you know, I feel like you really feel the PG rating, because I was
Yeah.
thinking like,
Mhm.
oh, this is like pre PG-13. I'm like, well,
It's
no,
not,
because
yeah.
like, you have Temple of Doom was like the first PG-13 movie.
Well,
Shout out to Spielberg
it
for.
wasn't PG-13, but it's the movie that started
Yeah,
it, yeah.
that's yeah. Shout out to Spielberg for developing PTSD in children for our
Yeah.
generation. But I feel like you really feel because like like all the scenes, like the little bit of warfare scenes we do get are fairly bloodless.
Yeah. Mhm.
Like I remember they have the shot where you have like the Chinese are like shooting down at the Japanese soldiers, and then it kind of cuts to them and pans back, and you see the guys laying on the ground with like a little tiny bit of red on the ground, and they get drug away,
Yeah.
and it's fairly bloodless. Or even the shot of his friend dying at the end, like you get a little bit of blood on the mango, but not to say that it has to be like this like super gory experience like a movie like Saving Private Ryan again, or Black Hawk Down is another one I think of that has like very realistic war violence.
Mm.
But I do think that I do think a little bit more of a darker edge would have served this story well and really helped drive home the theme of Jamie's innocence dying and like him really having to mature.
Sure.
And I think it would have really sold the ending where he's like literally unrecognizable to his parents a lot better,
Mm.
you know. Um, but again, like even the author himself said that like yeah, I mean I had a pretty good time. Like it was a pretty happy existence,
Yeah.
like in the camp.
Mhm.
Like so, maybe that is fairly true to his story. But in general, I think that that's like my biggest thing is just it's not the best example of Spielberg. I don't think it's not necessarily. It is a bit long for the story, and then I just feel like it needs a bit of a harder edge.
Yeah.
to be honest. I gave it 3 stars. I had it at 3.5 previously, but I think that was when I just like I think one of the things I did on Letterboxd like a year or two ago was I just like tried to think of every movie I know that I've seen and just
Try to guess.
gave them random gave them random ratings. But now that I actually watched it, like I logged it and I gave it three
Yeah.
3 stars because I mean Bale's performance is really great.
Yeah.
I mean you can't say that, and there are still some great moments of like that Spielbergian magic, so to speak. But for the most part, this is not necessarily one of his movies that I'm gonna go back to time and time again, like some others. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, I think I agree on that aspect. I don't know if this is one that I'll go back to a lot, but I really thought this was good. I feel like it's like a maybe a sleeper Spielberg. To me, I wasn't as bothered by like just saying this outright, like your like problems with the film are pretty much like shared by people that do have problems with the film. Like those are the pretty common things, like the length and the pacing of the end, the kind of like the lack of like grit, I guess, to it, all those sorts of things. That's to me, that stuff bothered me a whole lot. I think there's maybe some pacing issues. I talked about like, okay, there's some really strong visual stuff, and then there's some times where like the visual stuff is then like reiterated with like dialogue, and I'm like, okay, like you didn't have so like my quibbles are more like small scale things, like little quibbles, than like bigger scale like issues that I had with it that are more like you. So I actually gave this 4 stars. I really, really enjoyed it. I loved a lot of the imagery. I thought it was shot really well. I thought it really played into Spielberg's strengths as like a director of like just like I just think big. Like there's so many things in this movie that are just big. And I mean, it's not a shark or a T-Rex, or even like a spaceship or whatever. But like, it's like the stadium shot, like the shots of the plane, the shots of the city, even that you get, just like really stood out to me, and I really enjoyed those. And then like the pacing didn't bother me a whole lot. It almost felt like a like hangout movie with a kid at times. And some people like don't really go for hangout movies, but I tend to like well-made ones, and I kind of enjoyed the hangout feel of seeing what Jim was up to in the internment camp. And then like the performance was great, and I really like when emotions catch me off guard, like they did with the like I don't remember what my parents see. I really, really appreciate when that's well executed. So yeah, I enjoyed this. I gave it 4 stars. I do think it's like not one I'll necessarily like be like, oh yeah, I can't wait to watch that again. But like for like a one-time watch sort of movie, I thought it was like, yeah, I was into it. I enjoyed it. But yeah, so I don't think it's like a prime example of like a Spielberg movie necessarily, but yeah. But before we wrap up, I did have one final thought that I thought would be good to close with. Just talking about Spielberg kind of maturing as a creator, as an artist. This is a quote that he said. He said, quote, "Hitting 40, I really had to come to terms with what I've been tenaciously clinging to, which was a celebration of a kind of naivete that has been reconfirmed countless times in the amount of people who have gone to see E.T., Back to the Futures, Goonies, etc. I thought Empire was a great way of performing an exorcism on that period." And I really feel like this movie, along with The Color Purple, like kind of become a stepping stone into maybe the next phase of his career.
Yeah.
He still has Hook, like he has Hook. He doesn't, he does Last Crusade, Always, Hook are like the next 3 movies he makes. But like Always is a drama, like, and then Schindler's List is coming up soon, and especially like
Schindler's List and Jurassic Park in the
right,
same year,
yeah,
mind you.
and I think this movie is a real stepping stone towards Schindler's List. And I just think it's really interesting that he sees this movie as like an exorcism of those like clinging to childhood naivete. I just because it's like he's doing it along with Jim. And
Yeah, I mean,
just found that
I
really
think there's
interesting.
definitely something. Yeah, there's definitely something to be said where if you think about his career moving forward, he does a lot more mature work,
Yeah.
especially like the later '90s, early 2000s. I mean, just starts like I mean, Hook. Jurassic Park isn't necessarily a kids movie, but it's
It's
a lot of kids
it's a summer
see it, but
blockbuster kind of movie.
you do kind of start having a lot more of like the more serious,
Right.
mature Spielberg. I mean, even something like Minority Report,
Right.
is a much more serious, mature movie, or Munich, which is one of his movies I've never been able to see, but I've always wanted to. That I've heard is like kind of probably his most mature movie, or even like you got
AI.
Saving Private Ryan and AI, yeah, which I have a soft spot for. I know a lot of people don't love that movie, but I think it's fascinating. Um, I don't know. I think with Spielberg, it's interesting because it's like even a quote unquote bad Spielberg flick is like probably going to be better than a lot of other movies.
Yes. Except for 1941.
And well, like I guess like kind of like my closing thought is like kind of trying to think of like Spielberg at the peak of his powers, in the 80s into the 90s. But I wonder if he's lost something at this point because if I'm really honest, like I can't really think of a Spielberg movie in recent memory that I've like really 100% been like, wow, that was. Now, admittedly, I have not seen The Fabelmans. I've heard it's great. I'm sure I would like it.
The Fabelmans.
But whether it be some of his more dramatic takes, like what did he do that movie with Tom Hanks and Mark Rylance, Bridge of Spies. Never saw it. It looks kind
good.
of meh.
It's good. It's pretty good.
Or even like Ready Player One, which I did see in theaters, and I thought it was okay. Like it wasn't, groundbreaking, but he's definitely someone that as long as he's making movies, I'll still try and see them.
Even okay Spielberg movies, like you said, are just like still well worth seeing.
True, but at the same time, I'm just like I don't know, man. I sometimes wonder if he's lost a little bit of the magic along the way.
I think you should. Have you seen his West Side Story?
Oh, I did love that.
Yeah.
I did love that. But I grew up. I grew up in a family where we watched musicals a lot. I watched the original.
I thought his
West Side Story.
Yeah, his camera work.
I thought it was
in West Side Story is like incredible. I thought.
Yeah, I thought it was a pretty good
and Fabelmans
modernization.
I think Fabelmans is another like really, really, really great movie. So those back to
maybe he's still hidden in the drama department. But I guess as far as like the summer blockbuster.
Yeah, maybe in the summer blockbuster, but yeah, those two back to back are like okay. I think Spielberg's like really hitting the late career run of really good movies. But yeah, I do think this movie, The Color Purple and this movie, I think do act as like a turning point in his career. He still has obviously some blockbusters coming up with Jurassic Park and Hook and whatnot, but like these
Jurassic Park: The Lost World, which is the best one.
Is that your hot take?
I think some people probably say it's a hot take. That's my favorite Jurassic Park movie. Is the second one, just because I think when they're on the island, it might be a little bit more intriguing than the first movie. I love the first one,
Yeah,
obviously,
right.
But I don't know.
Yeah,
that's
a good hot take. I like it. But yeah, this is a stepping stone in Spielberg's career. I'll be interested to see kind of like as I continue through, which I'm not sure if I'm going to take a break when I finish the 80s or just keep going with Spielberg. I'll just kind of, I guess I'll decide when I get there. But yeah, I am interested to see like what things
if you
look
keep
like.
going, you're going to be doing Spielberg for another like 2-3 months.
No, it'll be longer than that. This has been all year I've been in Spielberg, which
Oh yeah, it might be time to shift it up a little bit. I don't know.
yeah, but
maybe revisit them
this
later.
will end in I'll end with the 70s and 80s at the end of August, and so we'll see where it goes from there. But yeah, I'm enjoying it so far. I'm glad it's filling in some. This was a blind spot for me, so it's filling in all my Spielberg blind spots. So that's the good part. But yeah, I think we've done all we can on Empire of the Sun for now. So we're gonna wrap it up. We do have, well, before I get to that, JP, why don't you tell the good people where they can find you, keep an eye out on maybe like some projects you're working on or what you're up to.
I mean, the easiest way to connect with me is on Instagram. My handle is just my name, Jean-Pierre Boudreaux, and then as far as what I got cooking, I think this year will be the year that I start my own kind of like variety show. It's called Thanks for Letting Me Ramble. So be on the lookout for that, and definitely gonna have Eli on at some point for sure.
Yeah, I look forward to it. Repay the favor. Since you're about
at least 4 times, I'll have to be on at least. I'll have to be on at least 4 times.
Yeah, so I look forward to that. Maybe by the time this episode releases, you'll have a feed that I can link in the episode notes. So
yeah, I'm hoping so. I'm hoping to try and get like a couple episodes recorded, like before I put anything out, so I kind of can start,
Yeah.
But we'll see.
Yeah. Well, sweet.
So.
Yeah, well, I'll make sure to link all those things in the episode notes. We Jean-Pierre Boudreaux, not Boudreaux, like I said for some ridiculous reason at the beginning of the episode. JP will be joining us again next week for none other than a Christian Bale performances draft. Excited for that.
I mean, you guys got to tune in for that because it's gonna be a hard fight for sure.
Empire of the Sun is the official honorable mention for that. So, which I think you can make a case that it should be drafted, but yeah, we'll see what performances we draft of Christian Bale's in honor of this movie discussion next week, and then after that we'll be getting into Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. So wrapping up the original trilogy. So that'll be fun. But yeah, that's all we have for this week. So I've been Eli Price for JP Boudreaux. You've been listening to The Establishing Shots. We will see you next time.
We were happy here. For a little while.
But look, I figure it this way. Better to be king for a night than schmuck for a lifetime.